Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey through the darkest corners of beauty history. Imagine standing before your mirror carefully painting your face with a thick white paste. Your skin tingles, then burns. Your hair falls out in clumps. Your gums bleed. But you smile because finally, you look like a queen. What if I told you that for over 3 centuries, millions of women did exactly this, knowingly poisoning themselves one brush stroke at a time? Tonight, we're diving into the deadly secret behind history's most coveted complexion. Welcome to a story where beauty wasn't just pain, it was poison. Before we step into the shadows of Renaissance Europe together, I want to ask something. If this story makes you see beauty differently, if it makes you think, feel, or even gasp out loud, would you hit that like button? And hey, subscribe if you want more of these deep dives into history's most fascinating secrets. I'm genuinely curious, where are you watching this from right now? Your bedroom, late at night, somewhere across the world. Drop a comment and tell me I actually read them all, and I love knowing who's on this journey with me. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe grab some tea and let's travel back in time together. This is going to be a long night, and trust me, you'll want to hear every word. Picture this Venice 1560. The sun is setting over the Grand Canal, casting golden light across marble palaces. Inside one of these palaces, a young noblewoman sits at her vanity. Her name is Isabella, and tonight is the most important night of her life. The Duke of Milan is coming to dinner, and her family's fortune depends on her making the perfect impression. Her maid approaches with a small ceramic pot. Inside is a thick, creamy white paste that smells faintly of vinegar. Isabella knows what it is. Everyone knows what it is. They call it Venetian ceruse, the miracle makeup that transforms ordinary skin into the luminous, ghostly white complexion that every man desires and every woman envies. Isabella also knows something else. She knows that her cousin Sophia used this same paste for 2 years before she died last winter. Sophia was only 23. Toward the end, Sophia's beautiful face had begun to crack and peel. Her hair fell out in patches. She couldn't stop trembling. But even on her deathbed, Sophia's skin was still that perfect, enviable white. Isabella dips her brush into the ceruse anyway. Because here's the thing about being a woman in Renaissance Europe, or really a woman anywhere in any time, sometimes the choice isn't between safety and beauty. Sometimes the choice is between invisibility and survival. And invisible women don't marry dukes. Let me take you back even further, because this story doesn't start in Venice. It starts in ancient Greece and Rome, where pale skin first became the ultimate status symbol. And it makes perfect sense when you think about it, right? If you're a wealthy woman, you don't work in the fields. You don't labor under the scorching sun. You spend your days indoors reading poetry, playing music, being idle and pale and valuable. Tanned skin meant you were a peasant, a farmer's wife, someone who worked, but pale skin. Pale skin meant you were important enough that other people did your work for you. The Romans created the first version of this white makeup, a powder made from lead. Yes, the same lead that we now know destroys your brain, your kidneys, and pretty much every major organ in your body. But back then, it was just called beauty. They mixed white lead with vinegar until it formed a thick paste, and Roman women applied it religiously, layering it on day after day. Here's something that'll make your skin crawl. The process of making ceruse actually created toxic fumes that killed the workers who produced it. The people making the makeup died so that wealthy women could wear it. Even back then, beauty had a body count. But it was Renaissance Europe, particularly Venice and England, where this obsession with white lead makeup reached its terrifying peak. And one woman became the ultimate symbol of this deadly beauty standard, Queen Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth was an extraordinary woman. She ruled England for 45 years, defeated the Spanish Armada, ushered in a golden age of arts and literature, and never married, a scandalous choice that gave her the nickname the Virgin Queen. She was brilliant, ruthless, politically savvy, and according to every portrait you've ever seen of her, pale as a ghost. That famous white face wasn't just makeup, it was armor, it was power, it was a political statement. Every time Elizabeth appeared in public with her face painted white, her cheeks rouged with red dye, her lips darkened with cochineal, she was saying, "I am untouchable. I am divine. I am not like you." But here's what those portraits don't show you: the real cost of that perfect face. Elizabeth's ceruse was made from white lead carbonate mixed with vinegar. Basically, she was painting her face with poison every single day. Contemporary accounts tell us that by the time she was in her 60s, her face was scarred and deeply wrinkled beneath the makeup. She had lost most of her hair and wore increasingly elaborate wigs. Her teeth had turned black and were falling out, though that might have also been from her love of sugar, which was another expensive status symbol at the time. Can we just pause here for a second? The Queen of England, one of the most powerful people in the entire world, was literally poisoning herself for beauty. If she couldn't escape these standards, what chance did ordinary women have? Let me tell you exactly what Cyrus did to the women who wore it, because it's important to understand that this wasn't a quick death. This was slow torture. First, the lead would be absorbed through your skin. At first, you might not notice anything except that your complexion was improving, the makeup-covered blemishes evened out your skin tone, gave you that coveted pale look. You looked wealthy. You looked desirable. You looked dying, but nobody called it that yet. Then the symptoms would start. Your skin would become dry and cracked. The lead was literally corroding your face from the outside in. Your gums would become inflamed and start bleeding. Your hair would thin and fall out in patches. You'd develop tremors in your hands. Your muscles would weaken. You'd have trouble thinking clearly, remembering things, concentrating. And here's the truly tragic part. As your skin deteriorated from the lead poisoning, you'd look worse without the makeup. So you'd apply more Cyrus to cover the damage, which would cause more damage, which would require more Cyrus. It was a vicious cycle that only ended one way. Women suffered from paralysis, brain damage, and excruciating muscle pain. Some went mad. Lead poisoning causes neurological damage that can manifest as confusion, personality changes, and hallucinations. Imagine looking in the mirror and not recognizing the person staring back at you, but still reaching for that pot of white paste because it's the only way you know how to be beautiful. The final stage was death. Usually from organ failure, your kidneys and liver simply couldn't process the toxic load anymore. Now you might be thinking, okay, but they didn't know it was poison, right? This was before modern science. Wrong, they knew. By the 16th century, doctors were actively warning women about the dangers of Cyrus. Medical texts from the period explicitly state that white lead is toxic and that cosmetics containing it cause illness and death. In 760, a famous doctor named James Adair wrote, "The white paint commonly sold under the name of Cyrus or white lead is so hurtful to health that its use should be rejected. But here's where it gets really dark. Women kept using it anyway." Let me tell you about Lady Maria Gunning later, known as Lady Coventry. She was one of the famous Gunning sisters, celebrated beauties of 1700s London society. Maria was so beautiful that crowds would gather just to see her walk down the street. People would literally mob her carriage trying to get a glimpse of her face. She wore Cyrus every single day. Her husband, the Earl of Coventry, actually begged her to stop. He could see what it was doing to her, but Maria refused. In her mind, her beauty was her power, her currency, her entire identity. Without it, who was she? Lady Coventry died in 1760 at the age of 27. The official cause of death was listed as consumption, what we now call tuberculosis. But historians believe the lead poisoning from her makeup either caused her death directly or weakened her immune system so severely that she couldn't fight off the disease. 27 years old. At an age when she should have been in the prime of her life, she was dead. For beauty. But here's what really gets me about this story, the inequality of it all. See, only wealthy women could afford Cyrus. It was expensive, good quality, white lead mix just right, cost real money. Poor women, working women, they just had their natural skin. And yeah, they were probably mocked for it, considered less beautiful, less marriageable, but they were also alive. Meanwhile, the aristocratic women who could afford the best makeup were literally paying for the privilege of poisoning themselves. The very thing that was supposed to elevate them above common women was killing them. And the men who created these beauty standards, who married these women who benefited from their beauty, they didn't wear Cyrus. Their faces stayed unpainted. Their bodies stayed unpoisoned. They just stood back and judged which woman had achieved the most perfect, most deathly white complexion. There's something almost vampiric about it, isn't there? The way beauty sucked the life out of these women, slowly draining them until there was nothing left but the ghost white mask they'd painted on. Here's a detail that haunts me. Women would plan their makeup application like a military strategy. They knew that going outside in the heat would make the Cyrus-run lead, mixed with sweat, create streaks, and there was nothing less attractive than visible makeup. So wealthy women would stay indoors during the day, only venturing out in the evening when it was cooler. They'd carry fans constantly. They'd avoid any activity that might make them sweat. In other words, they imprisoned themselves. They limited their lives, their movements, their experiences, all to maintain an appearance that was literally killing them. And if you think that sounds ridiculous, ask yourself, how different is it really from modern women who can't eat in front of people because of diet culture, who won't go swimming because they're afraid of being seen in a bathing suit, who won't leave the house without makeup? The specifics change, but the cage remains the same. The use of ceruse didn't really end until the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and even then it wasn't because women suddenly woke up and decided their health mattered more than beauty. It was because zinc oxide became available as a cheaper, safer alternative for achieving white skin, and because the beauty standards themselves began to shift, the Industrial Revolution changed everything. Suddenly, pale skin meant you were stuck inside a factory, while wealthy people could afford to vacation and get suntans. Isn't that ironic? For centuries, women died to be pale. Then the standards flipped and women started dying to be tan, but that's another story for another night. But here's the thing that I can't stop thinking about. We look back at these Renaissance women painting lead on their faces and we think, how could they be so foolish? How could they choose beauty over life? But are we really any different? We inject botulinum toxin, literally one of the most lethal substances on Earth, into our faces and call it Botox. We undergo surgeries with real risks of death just to change our appearance. We develop eating disorders. We take diet pills that damage our hearts. We use tanning beds that cause cancer. The tools change, but the pressure remains the same. Queen Elizabeth died in 1603 at the age of 69, remarkably old for her time, honestly. But accounts from her final years describe a woman whose face was so damaged by decades of ceruse that she barely looked human. She wore a finger's thickness of white paint even on her deathbed, and she refused to look in mirrors. She knew what she'd done to herself, she knew the price she'd paid, and she'd do it all again. Because in her world, beauty wasn't a choice, it was survival. So as we close this chapter of our story, I want you to think about something. Every time you look in the mirror and criticize yourself, every time you think you're not pretty enough, not thin enough, not enough, remember Lady Coventry, remember Queen Elizabeth, remember Isabella in Venice dipping her brush into poison because she had no other choice. You have a choice. You always have a choice. Your life is worth more than any beauty standard. Your health is worth more than other people's approval. Your existence, exactly as you are right now, is worth more than all the ceruse in all of Renaissance Europe. These women died so we could learn this lesson. Let's not waste their sacrifice. But our journey through history's deadly beauty rituals is just beginning. Because while these European women were painting lead on their faces, women in Venice were doing something equally dangerous to their eyes, using a poison so deadly it's named after the goddess of fate who cuts the thread of life. Next, we're traveling to Renaissance Italy to discover why women willingly blinded themselves for beauty, and how a plant called Beautiful Woman became every ophthalmologist's nightmare. Stay with me. This story gets darker before it gets better. But I promise you by the end of this night you'll see beauty in yourself in a completely different light. You know what's fascinating about poison. Sometimes we name it after beautiful women, and sometimes beautiful women name themselves after poison. Tonight we're talking about a plant so dangerous that just touching it can give you a rash. Yet for hundreds of years women squeezed its juice directly into their eyes, on purpose. Multiple times a day, the plant is called a troppa belladonna. In Italian, belladonna means beautiful woman. But in Greek mythology, Atropos was one of the three fates, the one who cuts the thread of life. So this plant's name literally translates to the beautiful woman who decides when you die. And somehow that didn't stop anyone from using it as makeup. If that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about beauty standards, I don't know what will. Let's go back to Venice again, because apparently Renaissance Venetians had a death wish when it came to cosmetics. We've already talked about them painting their faces with lead. But that wasn't enough. They also wanted their eyes to look bigger, brighter, more captivating. They wanted that wide-eyed, innocent, seductive look that made men fall at their feet. There was just one problem: human pupils don't naturally stay dilated. Unless you're in love in danger or poisoned, enter belladonna. Here's how it worked. A woman, let's call her Lucia, would buy a small vial of belladonna tincture from an apothecary. The apothecary would extract the juice from the berries of the deadly nightshade plant, sometimes mixing it with water or wine to dilute it. Just a little. Not enough to be safe, mind you. Just enough that you probably wouldn't die immediately. Lucia would tilt her head back and, using a small glass dropper if she was wealthy, or just her finger if she wasn't, she'd squeeze a drop or two into each eye, and then the magic would happen. Within minutes, her pupils would start to expand, wider and wider until the black nearly swallowed up the colour of her iris entirely. Her eyes would look huge, luminous, mesmerising. She'd look like a Renaissance painting come to life. She'd look like every man's dream. She also couldn't see properly anymore, but hey, who needs vision when you're beautiful, right? Let me explain the science here, because it's actually pretty incredible in a horrifying sort of way. Belladonna contains a chemical called atropine. Atropine is what we call a muscarinic antagonist, which is a fancy way of saying it blocks certain receptors in your muscles. Specifically, it blocks the receptors that tell your pupils to constrict. Your pupils naturally get smaller in bright light to protect your retina. It's like your eyes' built-in sunglasses. But atropine basically breaks that mechanism. Your pupils stay wide open no matter how bright it is. The effect is temporary, it lasts maybe a few hours, which means if you wanted to maintain that look all day, you had to keep applying more drops, more poison, more damage, and the side effects. Oh, they were delightful. Blurred vision, obviously. You literally couldn't focus your eyes on anything close to you. Reading was impossible. Sewing was impossible. Recognizing people's faces from more than a few feet away was impossible. You became functionally blind to everything except the vague shapes and colours of the world around you. Your eyes would also become extremely sensitive to light. Imagine every candle feeling like staring at the sun. Every time you went outside, even on a cloudy day, the light would be almost unbearably painful. So women would carry parasols and fans not just for shade, but as shields against the agony of ordinary daylight. Your heart rate would increase. Atropine affects your cardiovascular system. It makes your heart beat faster, which in small doses might just make you feel a bit flushed and anxious. In larger doses, it could cause heart palpitations, dizziness, even cardiac arrest, and with prolonged use, permanent damage. Chronic atropine exposure can destroy your vision entirely. You'd develop what we now call accommodative dysfunction. Your eyes would lose the ability to focus at all. You'd be trapped in a permanent blur, unable to see anything clearly for the rest of your life. But your eyes would still be beautiful, even if you couldn't see out of them anymore. Now here's where the story gets even more interesting. Because the use of belladonna as a beauty product isn't just a European thing. Cleopatra. Yes, that Cleopatra reportedly used extracts from Egyptian henbane, another nightshade plant that contains atropine for the same purpose. Think about that for a second. Cleopatra, one of the most powerful, intelligent, politically savvy women in all of ancient history, allegedly put poison in her eyes to look more attractive. A woman who spoke 9 languages, who ruled Egypt for over 20 years, who commanded armies and negotiated with Rome, and she still felt the need to dilate her pupils for men. Although, to be fair, when you're trying to seduce Julius Caesar, and then Mark Antony, maybe you need every advantage you can get, even if that advantage is technically a neurotoxin. But here's something most people don't know. The whole story about Cleopatra using belladonna might actually be a myth, or at least a confusion of historical facts. Ancient texts tell us that Egyptian women used kohl, that black eyeliner we talked about earlier, and various plant extracts for their eyes. But the specific claim about Cleopatra dilating her pupils with nightshade seems to have been added later, possibly by Renaissance writers, who are projecting their own beauty practices onto ancient history. It's like a game of historical telephone, where each generation assumes that the women before them must have been just as obsessed with beauty, and just as willing to suffer for it as they are. Whether or not Cleopatra actually used belladonna, the belief that she did made the practice even more popular in Renaissance Europe. Because if the legendary Queen of Egypt did it, then surely it must be the key to irresistible beauty. Let me tell you a story that didn't make it into most history books, but should have. In 1813, a British ophthalmologist and eye doctor published a case study about a young woman we'll call Catherine. Catherine was 19 years old, recently married, and eager to please her new husband. She'd heard from other society ladies that belladonna drops would make her more alluring, more desirable. So she bought a vial from an apothecary and began using it daily. At first, everything seemed fine. Her pupils dilated beautifully. Her husband complimented her eyes. She felt confident, attractive, desired. Success, right. Then, after about 3 months, she noticed that her vision wasn't returning to normal between applications. Even when the drops wore off, everything remained slightly blurry. She couldn't read her letters anymore without holding them at arm's length. She had trouble with needlework, a crucial skill for a lady of her station, but she kept using the drops. Because her husband liked her eyes that way. Because stopping would mean admitting that vanity had damaged her. Because beauty once achieved is terrifying to lose. By the time she finally saw the doctor 6 months after she'd started using belladonna, the damage was irreversible. Her eyes had lost the ability to accommodate to adjust focus between near and far objects. At 19 years old, she had the vision of a 70-year-old with cataracts. The doctor's report notes that she wept during the examination, but he observed that her tears didn't fall normally. The belladonna had affected her tear ducts as well. Even her crying was broken. The report ends with a plea to other women to avoid belladonna cosmetics. But did they listen? Of course not. Because one woman's tragedy is just an anecdote. But a whole society telling you that you need to be beautiful to be valuable, that's an imperative. Here's something that'll make your skin crawl. Belladonna isn't just dangerous when you put it directly in your eyes. The plant itself is one of the most toxic in the entire Eastern Hemisphere. Every part of the plant is poisonous. The leaves, the stems, the roots, but especially those pretty little purple-black berries that look like tiny, shiny grapes. Children have died from eating as few as 2 or 3 berries, because unlike most poisonous plants that taste terrible, belladonna berries actually taste sweet, nature's cruelest trick. If you ingest belladonna, even a small amount, you're in for a nightmare. First comes the dry mouth so severe that you can barely speak. Then hallucinations, vivid, terrifying visions, confusion, delirium. You might think you can fly, you might think you're someone else, you might not think at all. There's actually a creepy historical connection here. Some historians believe that the flying ointment used by medieval witches contained belladonna, along with other nightshade plants like henbane and mandrake. Women would rub this ointment on their skin, sometimes on broomsticks, which they'd then ride, and the psychoactive compounds would be absorbed through their skin and mucous membranes. The hallucinations that followed felt like flying. So when we picture witches flying on broomsticks, we might actually be remembering women who were so desperate to escape their oppressive lives that they poisoned themselves into hallucinating freedom. Kind of poetic. Definitely tragic. Now you might be wondering, didn't anyone try to stop this? Didn't doctors or scientists speak out? Oh, they tried. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, medical professionals published warnings about belladonna. They documented cases of blindness, of permanent eye damage, of accidental deaths from overdose. They begged women to stop. And some women did listen, but many didn't. Because here's the brutal truth when a society tells you that your value is determined by your appearance. Warnings about health consequences don't carry much weight. What good is being healthy if you're unmarriageable? What good is having perfect vision if no one wants to look at you? It's the same logic that drives modern cosmetic surgery risks, extreme dieting, everything we've already discussed. The calculation is always the same: what's the worst that could happen versus what's certain to happen if I'm not beautiful enough. And usually the certain thing, loneliness, poverty, social rejection, feels more frightening than the possible thing, death, disfigurement, disease. Here's an irony that I find almost funny in a dark way. Eye doctors today still use atropine. In fact, if you've ever had your pupils dilated for an eye exam, congratulations, you've experienced exactly what Renaissance women paid good money for. The difference is that modern ophthalmologists use carefully calibrated doses. They only do it occasionally, and they warn you about all the side effects first. Oh, and they don't tell you it'll make you beautiful. They tell you it'll make you temporarily blind to anything closer than 3 feet away, and that you should definitely not drive home afterward. Somehow that wasn't part of the Renaissance marketing strategy. Atropine also has legitimate medical uses beyond eye exams. It's used as an antidote to certain poisons, specifically nerve agents and organophosphate insecticides. During World War II, soldiers carried atropine injectors in case of chemical warfare attacks. The same substance that women used for beauty literally saved lives on the battlefield, which just goes to show it's not the substance itself that's good or evil. It's how we use it, and why. The practice of using belladonna for cosmetic purposes finally died out in the late 1800s and early 1900s, around the same time that ceruse fell out of fashion. Not because women suddenly became less vain or more sensible, but because medical knowledge advanced to the point where the dangers couldn't be ignored anymore, and because crucially safer alternatives became available. Also, beauty standards shifted. By the Victorian era, the wide-eyed innocent look was being replaced by a more natural aesthetic, which is hilarious because Victorian beauty was about as natural as a 3-layer cake, but at least they stopped intentionally blinding themselves. But here's the kicker. Belladonna eye drops are still sold today. Not in mainstream stores, obviously, but in certain alternative medicine circles and historical reenactment communities. You can buy them online if you know where to look, and yes, some people still use them, which means we've learned nothing, absolutely nothing. I think what haunts me most about the Belladonna story isn't even the physical damage, terrible as that was. It's the blindness metaphor. These women were literally making themselves blind in pursuit of beauty. They were choosing not to see the world clearly, not to read, not to do detailed work, not to recognize faces. They were sacrificing their ability to perceive reality accurately, all to change how others perceived them. And isn't that exactly what beauty standards still do? They blind us to our own value. They make us unable to see ourselves clearly. We look in the mirror and we can't recognize our own beauty, because we're too busy comparing ourselves to impossible standards. Every filtered photo on Instagram is a kind of belladonna distorting reality, making us question what we actually look like, leaving us unable to focus on what's real and important. The women who used belladonna couldn't see the words on a page. We can't see our own worth. Different methods, same blindness. Here's a question I want you to think about, and feel free to leave your answer in the comments. What are you willing to sacrifice for beauty? Where's your line? Because everyone has one, whether we admit it or not. Maybe you wouldn't put poison in your eyes, but would you skip meals to lose weight? Would you spend money you don't have on makeup or clothes or treatments? Would you undergo surgery with real risks? Would you change something fundamental about yourself, your personality, your interest, your dreams to be more attractive to someone else? The women who used belladonna didn't think they were doing anything extreme. They thought they were just doing what was necessary to succeed in their world. And in their world they were right. The rules were rigged against them and beauty was the only currency they had. But here's the thing. You have more currency than they did. You have options they never dreamed of. You can vote. You can own property. You can have careers. You can choose not to marry at all. You don't have to trade your health for desirability because your desirability isn't your only source of power anymore. So why do we still make that trade? Why do we still blind ourselves in new and creative ways? I don't have a perfect answer. But I think it's worth asking the question. The name belladonna, beautiful woman, has outlived the practice itself. The plant still grows wild across Europe and parts of Asia. It's still just as poisonous. Those purple flowers are still just as pretty, and those berries are still just as deadly. But now we know what it is. We call it by its other name too, deadly nightshade. We teach our children not to touch it. We put up warning signs. We've learned to recognize poison when we see it. Most of the time anyway. So we've covered 2 deadly beauty practices now, Cerise for the face, belladonna for the eyes. But we're nowhere near done. Because while European women were destroying their vision and their skin, women on the other side of the world were consuming something even deadlier. Not for their faces or their eyes, but for their entire complexion. A poison so toxic that it's named after a god of murder, and yet for decades it was sold as complexion wafers, beauty you could eat like candy, and women did, in droves, even though they absolutely knew it was killing them. Let's talk about arsenic, and about the Victorian women who chose death by poison over life without beauty. Because if you thought the last 2 stories were dark, buckle up. This one is going to hurt. There's a special kind of horror in choosing your own poison. Not being forced, not being tricked, but knowing exactly what you're doing and doing it anyway. That's what we're dealing with now. Imagine walking into a pharmacy in 1890s New York or London. The shelves are lined with beautiful tins and delicate glass bottles. Everything looks medicinal, trustworthy, scientific. And there displayed prominently near the counter is a product that promises to transform your skin. It's called Dr. Campbell's Safe Arsenic Complexion Wafers. And the label guarantees they're absolutely harmless to even the most delicate person. The label is lying. But here's the thing, by the 1890s everyone knew it was lying. Arsenic had been a well-documented poison for literally thousands of years. And yet these wafers flew off the shelves. Women bought them by the boxful. Some took them for years. Welcome to the most premeditated beauty suicide in history. Let's start with what arsenic actually is, because I think it's important to understand just how toxic we're talking about here. Arsenic is a naturally occurring element number 33 on the periodic table if you remember your high school chemistry. It's found in rocks and soil all over the world. In small amounts, it's everywhere. In larger amounts, it's one of the most effective poisons humanity has ever discovered. The medieval nickname for arsenic was inheritance powder, which should tell you everything you need to know. It was the murder weapon of choice for anyone wanting to kill someone slowly enough that it looked like natural illness. Kings, popes, wealthy merchants, if you had power and enemies in medieval Europe, you were probably at least a little worried about arsenic in your wine. The symptoms of arsenic poisoning mimic cholera or food poisoning, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, dehydration. Before modern toxicology, it was almost impossible to prove someone had been poisoned with arsenic rather than just dying of natural causes. It was the perfect crime, and then someone looked at arsenic and thought, yes, this murder weapon would make an excellent beauty product. I'm not even kidding, that's essentially what happened. The story actually begins in a place called Styria, a region that covered parts of modern-day Austria and Slovenia. In the early 1800s, travellers to Styria brought back reports of something absolutely bizarre. The local people were eating arsenic. On purpose. Regularly. These Styrian arsenic eaters, as they came to be known, would consume small amounts of white arsenic, usually the size of a grain of rice, and gradually increase their dosage over time, building up a tolerance. They claimed it gave them better wind for climbing mountains, made them look healthier and more robust, gave them clear skin and bright eyes. And here's the wild part: it kind of worked. Temporarily. In small, carefully controlled doses, arsenic can cause a temporary bloom to the skin. It slightly dilates blood vessels, bringing more blood to the surface, creating a rosy, healthy-looking flush. It can make your eyes appear brighter. Some reports even claimed it helped people gain weight in an attractive way, giving women that desirable plump look that was fashionable in the 19th century. The catch: you had to keep taking it, because once you stopped you'd look worse than before. And if you kept taking it, you'd eventually poison yourself to death. But in the meantime, you'd look healthy, right up until you weren't. When word of the Styrian arsenic eaters reached Western Europe and America, it sparked an absolute craze. If peasants in the mountains of Austria could look rosy and healthy by eating arsenic, imagine what it could do for pale, fashionable ladies in London or New York. Enter Dr. James P. Campbell, entrepreneur and sociopath, though they didn't use that word back then. They just called him a businessman. In the 1890s, Campbell began manufacturing and selling arsenic complexion wafers. These were small, candy-like tablets that contained, and I cannot stress this enough, actual arsenic. The poisonous kind, the murder kind. The same substance that had killed countless people throughout history. But Campbell was a marketing genius. His advertisements were everywhere, in newspapers, magazines, on billboards. They featured beautiful women with flawless skin testimonials from satisfied customers, and promises that would make modern advertising standards agencies have a collective heart attack. The wafers Campbell claimed would cure freckles, blackheads, pimples, vulgar redness, yellow or muddy skins, and other facial disfigurements. They would give you a beautiful complexion, and the best part, they were absolutely safe and harmless to anybody. Except, for the whole slowly killing you thing. Here's an actual quote from one of his advertisements. These wafers are absolutely safe and harmless to even the most delicate person, and are the only genuine cure for all skin diseases. That ran in Harper's Bazaar. Harper's Bazaar. One of the most respected fashion magazines in America was running ads for poison candy. The wafers cost about $1 for a box, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that's equivalent to about $30 today, and women were buying multiple boxes a month. This was a thriving business. Now let's talk about what actually happened when you took these wafers. At first, like with the Styrian arsenic eaters, you might actually see some improvement. Your skin would get a slight glow. You might feel a bit more energetic. Arsenic in small doses can act as a mild stimulant. You'd look in the mirror and think, it's working. This is amazing. So you'd keep taking them. Maybe you'd even increase your dose to get faster results. And then things would start to go wrong. Arsenic is what's called a cumulative poison. Your body can't easily get rid of it, so it builds up in your tissues over time, particularly in your skin, hair nails, and gastrointestinal tract. The more you take, the more accumulates until eventually you reach toxic levels. The first signs are subtle. Your stomach might hurt a bit. You might feel tired. Your hands might tingle. Easy to ignore, easy to attribute to something else. Just stress, you tell yourself. Just a passing illness. Then comes the hyperpigmentation dark spots, appearing on your skin, particularly on your palms and the soles of your feet. Ironically, the product you're taking to lighten your skin is actually making it darker. But by this point, you're dependent on the wafers, because stopping makes your skin look even worse. Your hair starts falling out. Your nails develop white lines across them, something we now call Mies lines, that are so characteristic of arsenic poisoning that forensic pathologists can identify them decades later by examining exhumed bodies. You develop arsenical keratosis, thick, scaly growths on your skin that look like tiny corns or warts. They appear on your palms, your feet, sometimes your torso. They're precancerous. Many of them will eventually become skin cancer if you live long enough, which you probably won't. Your kidneys start to fail. Your nervous system deteriorates. You develop peripheral neuropathy, where your hands and feet go numb or burn with pain. Your memory falters. You become confused, irritable, paranoid. And throughout all of this, you keep taking the wafers. Because stopping means admitting that you've poisoned yourself. Stopping means losing whatever marginal beauty benefit you think you're getting. Stopping means facing the reality that you've done something irreversible to your body. Let me tell you about a woman named Emily. She's not famous. I found her story in a medical journal from 1902, and the doctors didn't even use her real name, just called her Patient E. But her story stayed with me. Emily was 26 years old, unmarried, living in Boston. She worked as a seamstress and was desperate to improve her prospects. She had acne scars on her cheeks, not severe, but enough that she felt self-conscious about them. When she saw an advertisement for Dr. Campbell's wafers promising to erase all facial blemishes, she saved up her money and bought a box. She took them exactly as directed. 1 wafer, 3 times a day with meals. After 6 weeks her skin did look better. The redness had faded and her complexion seemed brighter. Encouraged, she continued. She took those wafers religiously for 8 months. Then one day at work, she collapsed. The doctor who examined her found all the classic signs of chronic arsenic poisoning: the dark spots on her palms, the white lines on her nails, the hair loss, the peripheral neuropathy. Her kidneys were damaged, her liver was struggling. When he asked her if she'd been exposed to arsenic, she showed him the tin of wafers in her purse. The doctor's report notes that Emily was horrified to learn she'd been poisoning herself. But here's the heartbreaking part: she was also devastated because her skin had looked so good. For the first time in her adult life she'd felt pretty, and now she was being told that feeling had cost her her health. Emily survived, but just barely. She spent 2 months recovering. Her kidneys never fully recovered. She developed vitiligo patches of depigmentation that left her with uneven skin tone for the rest of her life. The very thing she'd been trying to fix was made permanently worse by her attempt to fix it. And the cruelest irony, the acne scars she'd been so worried about. The doctor noted they were barely visible and of no cosmetic significance. She'd nearly killed herself over something that barely anyone else noticed. Now here's where this story gets really dark. Because I've been telling you that everyone knew arsenic was poison, and that's true. But I haven't told you the whole truth. The medical establishment didn't just know arsenic was dangerous. They were actively warning people. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, doctors published papers and gave lectures about the dangers of arsenic cosmetics. The British Medical Journal ran multiple articles detailing case studies of arsenic poisoning from beauty products. The American Medical Association spoke out against them. And Dr. Campbell, he knew too. Of course he knew. There's no way he didn't know he was selling poison. But he kept selling them anyway, and he kept claiming they were safe. And he made a fortune doing it. Why? Because there were no real regulations. The Pure Food and Drug Act, the first major consumer protection law in the United States, didn't pass until 1906. Before that, you could sell basically anything and make any claims you wanted. Caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. But even after regulations came in, arsenic cosmetics didn't disappear immediately. Some companies just changed their formulas slightly in their marketing language. Others moved their operations to countries with less strict regulations. The demand was still there, so the supply found a way. It wasn't until the 1930s and 1940s that arsenic cosmetics finally became truly rare in Western countries, not because companies stopped making them, but because women stopped buying them. Why? Because beauty standards changed. Tanned skin came into fashion, so pale skin wasn't as valuable anymore. Makeup techniques improved, so there were better ways to achieve a good complexion. In other words, arsenic cosmetics ended not because we collectively decided women's lives mattered more than their appearance, but because the appearance we wanted changed. Think about that for a minute. But wait, there's more, and this is the part that should make you angry. Arsenic cosmetics aren't entirely a thing of the past. In some parts of the world, particularly in South Asia and West Africa, skin lightening products containing arsenic are still sold today. Usually illegally, often unlabeled, but still available if you know where to look. In 2017, the World Health Organization tested skin lightening products from several countries and found that a significant percentage contained dangerous levels of mercury, lead or arsenic. These products are sold in immigrant communities and small shops online. People use them because colonialism has so deeply embedded the idea that lighter skin is better, that they're willing to risk their lives for it. And before we get too comfortable thinking this is just a problem over there, remember that the American beauty industry is still largely unregulated. The FDA doesn't have the authority to approve cosmetics before they go on the market. Companies can use most ingredients without any safety testing. Lead has been found in lipsticks, formaldehyde in hair straighteners, asbestos in makeup palettes. We've gotten better, sure, but we're not safe, not even close. There's a photograph I've seen, I can't get it out of my head. It's from around 1895, an advertisement for arsenic wafers. It shows a woman in profile, her skin perfect and glowing, her expression serene. And the slogan reads, "A beautiful complexion is a woman's greatest asset." Not her mind, not her skills, not her character or her strength or her kindness, her complexion. That's her greatest asset. And for that asset, women were willing to die. Literally. But here's what kills me. They weren't stupid. They weren't naive. They were making a rational calculation based on the world they lived in. A world where a woman's value really was largely determined by her appearance. A world where being beautiful could mean the difference between marriage and spinsterhood, between comfort and poverty, between mattering and disappearing. When your choices are risk death for a chance at the life you want, or accept a life of diminished prospects, which one do you choose? Especially when you're 20 years old, and death feels far away and theoretical, but loneliness feels immediate and certain. I'm not saying their choice was right. I'm saying it was understandable, and that breaks my heart. Can I ask you something? And I mean this genuinely because I think about it a lot. How many years of your life would you trade for perfect skin? Not pretty good skin. Perfect skin. Never another pimple, never another wrinkle, never another dark spot or scar or anything. Just flawless magazine cover skin for the rest of your life. Would you trade 1 year, 5, 10? The women who took arsenic wafers weren't explicitly making that trade, but in retrospect, that's what they did. They traded years, sometimes decades of their lives for a few months or years of better skin. And the tragedy is that most of them didn't even get the full benefit. They died before they got married, before they achieved whatever goal they thought the pretty skin would help them reach. They just died pretty, that's all. There should be a better ending to that sentence. There isn't. By the early 1900s, deaths from arsenic cosmetics had become common enough that newspapers regularly reported on them. But they rarely blamed the manufacturers. Instead, the articles would have headlines like, "Woman's vanity proves fatal," or "Death from beauty treatment," as if it was the woman's fault for being vain, not the company's fault for selling poison. That's victim blaming at its finest, isn't it? Sell someone poison, they die, and somehow it's their fault for buying it. Dr. Campbell, by the way, was never prosecuted. He died wealthy. The women who bought his wafers, many of them just disappeared from the historical record. Their deaths were attributed to natural causes, or wasting disease, or female troubles. Victorian euphemisms that could mean anything and therefore meant nothing. They don't have monuments. They don't have memorials. Most of them don't even have names we remember. They're just statistics in medical journals, case studies, patient E and patient F, and all the other patients who trusted that beauty products wouldn't kill them. You know what's strange? I can look at arsenic wafers and think, that's insane. Who would do that? But I live in a world where people still smoke cigarettes even though the package literally says they'll kill you, where people undergo cosmetic procedures with real mortality risks, where teenagers develop eating disorders trying to look like Instagram influencers who don't even look like their own photos. We haven't learned as much as we think we have. The difference between us and the Victorian women eating arsenic isn't that we're smarter or less vain. It's that our poisons are different, more subtle, better marketed, but they're still poisons. Every time you skip a meal to lose weight, you're eating arsenic. Every time you base your self-worth on your appearance, you're eating arsenic. Every time you look in the mirror and hate what you see, you're eating arsenic. It's just slower, and nobody's going to publish a case study about it. Here's the thing I want you to take away from this story: those women didn't die because they were weak, or stupid, or superficial. They died because they were trapped in a system that told them their appearance was their only value, and then sold them poison to achieve that appearance. That system still exists. The poison just has different names now. But you have something they didn't have. You have information. You have options. You have legal protections, at least in theory. You have the ability to say no in ways they never could. So say it. Say no to anyone who tells you that you need to risk your health for beauty. Say no to products that promise miracles. Say no to the voice in your head that says you're not enough as you are. Because you are enough. You are always enough. Emily Patient E didn't know that. But you do. Don't waste that knowledge. We've travelled through Europe now, through Italy, through England, through the poison palaces of Victorian beauty. But there's an entire other side of the world we haven't touched yet. And some of the most extreme beauty practices in history didn't happen in ballrooms or boudoirs. They happened to children, to little girls whose feet were broken before they could even understand why. We need to talk about China. We need to talk about foot binding. And I have to warn you, this next story is going to be physically painful to hear. But it's important. Because when we talk about beauty standards harming women, sometimes we forget that they start harming us before we're even old enough to choose. Let's continue. What I'm about to tell you lasted for 1,000 years, a full millennium. That's longer than most empires, longer than most religions in their pure form, longer than any fashion trend has any right to exist. And it was torture. Deliberate, systematic, generational torture of little girls. Not by monsters or villains, but by mothers, grandmothers, women who loved these children and broke their feet anyway. This is the story of foot binding in China, and I need to warn you, this one is different. Because all the other beauty practices we've talked about, at least the women chose them. They made terrible choices, but they were choices made by adults. This was done to children. Children who couldn't consent. Children who screamed and begged and cried, and it didn't matter, their feet were broken anyway. So take a breath. Maybe pause if you need to. Because we need to talk about this even though it's going to hurt, especially because it's going to hurt. The practice began around the 10th century during the Tang dynasty, though the exact origins are murky, as origins often are with things people later become ashamed of. The most popular legend says it started with an emperor's favourite concubine, a dancer named Yonyang. She bound her feet to make them small and curved, then danced on a lotus-shaped platform. The emperor was so enchanted that other court women began binding their feet to imitate her. It's a pretty story. It's probably not true, or at least not the whole truth. What is true is that by the Song dynasty around the 11th and 12th centuries, foot binding had spread from the imperial court to the upper classes and then gradually down through society until it became expected for almost every family that had any social aspirations at all. And it stayed that way for nearly 1,000 years. Let me repeat that because I don't think we can really comprehend the scale 1,000 years. From approximately 960 CE to 1949. That's 40 generations of women, 40 generations of little girls having their feet broken in the name of beauty. The bound feet were called lotus feet, golden lotus for the smallest, most perfect feet, about 3 inches long, silver lotus for feet around 4 inches, and if your feet were larger than that, well, you weren't desirable at all. You were a big foot, a term of derision that essentially meant you were unmarriageable, worthless, 3 inches. That's about the length of a credit card. That's what a grown woman's foot was supposed to be. Let me walk you through exactly what happened, because I think it's important to understand the physical reality of this practice. Not to be gratuitous, but because sanitizing it does a disservice to the girls who endured it. The process usually began when a girl was between 4 and 7 years old. Old enough that her bones had some hardness to them, but young enough that they were still somewhat pliable, young enough that she couldn't fight back effectively, young enough that she might not fully understand what was being done to her or why. Often the binding would happen in autumn or winter because the cold numbed the pain a little. Small mercies. First, the girl's feet would be soaked in a mixture of herbs and animal blood supposedly to soften the skin and prevent infection, though given the hygiene standards of medieval China, infection was almost inevitable anyway. Then came the breaking. All of her toes except the big toe would be bent down and under, forced toward the sole of her foot. Sometimes they broke naturally from the pressure. Sometimes they had to be deliberately broken. Either way, the sound, according to the few detailed accounts we have, was unmistakable. Then the foot would be wrapped in binding cloths, pulled tighter and tighter, forcing the arch up and the toes under. The wrappings had to be kept wet and tightly wrapped every day or two, pulled tighter each time. This went on for years. The foot literally had to be reshaped bone by bone until the arch was so high and the toes so compressed that the foot was less than half its natural size. Girls would scream, they would beg, they would cry until they vomited. Some tried to unwrap their feet at night while everyone slept. If their mothers caught them, they'd bind them even tighter as punishment. Because here's the cruelest part, it was usually the mothers who did this. Not some distant authority figure, not some stranger. Your own mother, the person who gave birth to you, who nursed you, who sang you lullabies, she was the one breaking your bones. She was the one tightening the bindings when you begged her to stop. She was the one telling you this was for your own good, even as tears ran down her face too. Can you imagine having to do that to your daughter? Can you imagine being that daughter, looking up at your mother and realizing she isn't going to save you? The physical consequences were catastrophic and lifelong. Many girls developed severe infections. Flesh would rot. Toes would die and fall off, which was sometimes considered a good thing because dead toes took up less space and made achieving the ideal 3-inch foot easier. Let that sink in for a moment. Dead toes were a beauty bonus. The smell was reportedly horrific. Bound feet had to be washed constantly, but the foot was so deformed and the bindings so tight that proper hygiene was nearly impossible. Many women dealt with chronic infections their entire lives. Walking was excruciating and difficult. Women with bound feet couldn't walk more than a few hundred yards without needing to rest. They developed a characteristic swaying gait, which was considered alluring and feminine, but which was actually just them struggling to balance on what were essentially stumps. They couldn't run. If there was a fire, an earthquake, a flood, any kind of emergency, they couldn't flee. They were dependent on others to carry them, helpless, literally crippled in the name of beauty. And as they aged, the problems multiplied. Broken bones set incorrectly led to arthritis. The unnatural posture required to walk on bound feet caused chronic back pain, hip problems, spine deformities. Many women in old age simply couldn't walk at all. But hey, at least their feet were beautiful, right? At least they got married. Let me tell you about a woman named Wang Lifen. We know about her because she was one of the last surviving women with bound feet. When she was interviewed by researchers in the 1990s, Wang Lifen was born in 1920 in rural China. When she was 5 years old, her mother began binding her feet. In the interview now, an elderly woman, she described the process. She said it felt like her feet were being torn apart from the inside. She said she couldn't sleep for months because of the pain. She said she begged her mother to stop and her mother cried but kept binding. When the interviewer asked why her mother did it if it caused so much suffering, Wang Lifen's answer was simple and heartbreaking: because she loved me. Her mother bound her feet because not binding them would make Wang Lifen unmarriageable, and an unmarriageable daughter in early 20th century China had no future. She'd be a burden on her family for life, unable to support herself, vulnerable to poverty and abuse. Binding her feet was an act of love, terrible, painful love, but love nonetheless. Wang Lifen did get married to a man who valued bound feet. She had children. By the standards of her time and culture, her mother's sacrifice and her own suffering had been worth it. But when the interviewer asked if she thought foot binding should return, she said no without hesitation. When asked if she would have bound her own daughter's feet if the practice hadn't been banned, she paused for a long time. Then she said, "I don't know. I hope I would have been strong enough to refuse, but I don't know." That's honesty. Brutal, painful honesty. She understood that she might have perpetuated the same torture on her own child, not out of cruelty but out of love. Because sometimes love means breaking your child's bones so society won't break her spirit. Now let's talk about why this happened. Because beauty isn't really the full answer. It never is. Bound feet were erotic to Chinese men of the era, yes. There's a whole genre of Chinese poetry and literature devoted to praising tiny feet. But it was more than just sexual attraction. Bound feet were a class symbol. See, a woman with bound feet couldn't do physical labor. She couldn't work in the fields, couldn't carry water, couldn't do most household chores. Her crippled feet announced to the world that her family was wealthy enough that she didn't need to work, that they could afford to have a daughter who was purely ornamental, In peasant families, the majority of the population bound feet were an investment. You crippled your daughter for 4 or 5 years, and in return maybe she could marry up. Maybe she could marry a merchant's son or a landlord's son and bring honour and money to the family. Maybe her suffering would elevate everyone. It was economic calculation dressed up as beauty standards. It always is, isn't it? And for the wealthy families, bound feet were proof of status. They separated you from the working class as clearly as any title or property deed. Your daughter's broken feet were your family's social resume. There was even a practical component that makes the whole thing even more sinister. A woman with bound feet couldn't easily run away. She couldn't leave an abusive marriage. She was literally and figuratively bound to her home, to her husband, to her in-laws. Foot binding didn't just modify women's bodies, it controlled their mobility, their freedom, their entire lives. It was patriarchy made flesh. Or rather, made bone. Broken bone. But here's something we often miss in Western tellings of this story. Chinese women weren't passive victims. Many of them resisted. There were women who refused to bind their daughters' feet even when it meant social ostracism. There were girls who repeatedly unwound their bindings, enduring beatings and rebinding until their mothers finally gave up. There were communities where women collectively decided to stop the practice, and there were women who once grown became activists against foot binding. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as China began modernizing and coming into contact with Western criticism of the practice, Chinese intellectuals, including many women, started the Natural Foot Society. They argued that foot binding weakened China, made Chinese women unable to contribute to building a modern nation. Notice the argument, though. Not, it's torture and we should stop torturing little girls. But it makes China look backward to foreigners, and it's economically inefficient. Because even reformers struggled to argue that women's suffering mattered in and of itself. It had to matter because it affected men, affected the nation, affected China's standing in the world. Still, the Natural Foot Society and similar groups did have an impact. By the early 1900s, foot binding was declining, especially in cities. The new Republic of China officially banned it in 1912, but bans don't instantly change culture, especially in rural areas. Families continued binding girls' feet in secret, especially in remote villages. It wasn't until 1949, when the Communist Party came to power under Mao Zedong, that foot binding truly ended. The communist government didn't just ban it, they sent representatives to villages to physically inspect girls' feet. They publicly shamed families who were still binding. They made it clear that foot binding was now seen as a symbol of China's feudal past that had to be destroyed to build a new society. So foot binding ended not because Chinese society decided women deserved bodily autonomy, but because political revolutionaries decided it represented the old order. The reason changed, but at least the practice finally stopped. There are still women alive today with bound feet. Not many, they'd have to be in their 80s or 90s at minimum born before the communist ban fully took effect. But they exist, living reminders of a practice that most of us can barely comprehend. Photographers have documented them. Their feet look almost alien, tiny, twisted, wrapped in embroidered shoes that are works of art designed to make the deformity beautiful. The women who wear them can barely walk. They lean on canes, on walls, on relatives. Every step is calculated, careful. And when they're asked about their feelings on foot binding, their answers are complicated. Some express relief that their daughters and granddaughters escaped. Some express grief for their own lost childhoods. Some, and this is perhaps the saddest part, express a strange pride. Because their bound feet made them desirable once, made them worthy. And it's hard to let go of the thing that gave you value, even if that thing destroyed you. One elderly woman, when asked if she regretted her bound feet, said, "My husband loved them. He said they were the most beautiful feet he'd ever seen. Would he have married me otherwise? I don't know. So do I regret them? I don't know." Imagine living 90 years and still not knowing if your suffering was worth it. Here's what keeps me up at night about this story: the mothers. Not the men who desired bound feet, not the society that demanded them, but the mothers who did the binding. Because they weren't monsters. They were women who had survived the same torture and were now inflicting it on their daughters. They were making an impossible choice in an impossible situation. They could refuse to bind their daughters' feet and watch them become social outcasts, unable to marry, suffering poverty and shame. Or they could break their daughters' bones and watch them suffer immediate intense pain for the chance of a better future. Some choice, right? And before we get too comfortable judging them, ask yourself, what are we doing to our daughters now? We're not breaking their bones, at least not literally, but we're teaching them that their value lies in their appearance. We're teaching them to diet before they even understand what calories are. We're teaching them to filter their photos, to hate their natural faces, to surgically alter their bodies as soon as they turn 18. We're not using binding cloths. We're using Instagram and TikTok and diet culture and cosmetic surgery. The methods change. The message remains the same. Your body as it naturally is not acceptable. So are we really any better than those Chinese mothers? Or have we just gotten better at pretending our torture isn't torture? There's a concept in psychology called intergenerational trauma, the idea that trauma can be passed down through generations, even to people who didn't experience the original traumatic event. Researchers have studied the descendants of Holocaust survivors, of slavery survivors, of genocide survivors. They find that trauma echoes through time, affecting people who weren't even born when the original harm occurred. I wonder about the descendants of bound-foot women, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who never had their feet bound but grew up hearing stories, seeing their grandmothers struggle to walk, watching their mothers care for elderly women with twisted feet. What does that do to your understanding of beauty of suffering, of what women are supposed to endure? And I wonder about us. We're the descendants of all the beauty practices we've discussed tonight. The lead face paint, the belladonna eye drops the arsenic wafers, the bound feet. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're our inheritance. The trauma of beauty standards is intergenerational too. Every time a teenage girl develops an eating disorder, we're still binding feet. Every time a woman dies from cosmetic surgery complications, we're still eating arsenic. Every time someone looks in the mirror and hates what they see, we're still applying ceruse. The binding cloths just look different now. Let me share something that gives me hope, though. When the Natural Foot Society was campaigning against foot binding in the early 1900s, they collected testimonials from women with bound feet. These women, many of them elderly, spoke about their suffering, about how much they wished they'd been spared, about how they'd never wanted it in the first place but had no choice. Their stories convinced countless mothers to leave their daughters' feet natural. These women took their own suffering and turned it into a gift for the next generation. They said in effect, "I suffered so you don't have to. Learn from my pain." That's what I hope we can do too. Learn from the pain of the women who came before us. Honour their suffering by refusing to repeat it in whatever new forms it takes. Because foot binding did end. It seemed eternal 1,000 years, but it ended. Which means our destructive beauty standards can end too. They're not inevitable. They're not natural. They're just what we've been doing. And we can choose to do something different. Those Chinese mothers who refused to bind their daughters' feet, who endured social pressure and criticism to spare their children pain, they were heroes. Quiet, unremembered heroes, but heroes nonetheless. You can be that hero too. You can be the one who breaks the cycle. Wang Lifen. The woman I mentioned earlier died in 2010 at the age of 90. Her bound feet had given her a husband, a family, a life that her society considered successful. They'd also given her decades of pain-limited mobility, and the knowledge that her suffering had been entirely unnecessary, just a tradition, nothing more. In one of her final interviews, she was asked what she wanted people to know about foot binding. She thought for a moment, then said, "It seemed important at the time. It wasn't. Nothing is important enough to do that to a child. Nothing is important enough to do that to a child. Remember that. Remember that the next time society tells you that your daughter needs to diet or wear makeup or change her body in any way, remember that the next time you look at yourself in the mirror and think about going to extremes to change what you see, nothing, not beauty, not marriage, prospects, not social acceptance, not anything is important enough to break a child or to break yourself. We've journeyed through poison now, poison painted on faces, dropped into eyes, eaten like candy, and bound around broken bones. We've seen 1,000 years of women suffering for beauty from Renaissance Venice to rural China. But we're not done yet. Because while Asian women were binding their feet and European women were eating arsenic, there was another deadly beauty practice happening that didn't discriminate by geography or race. A practice that's still killing women today, still sold legally, still advertised as safe. We need to talk about mercury, not just as an ingredient, but as the centerpiece of an entire industry, built on the most profitable beauty standard ever invented, the belief that skin should be lighter than it naturally is. And this one is going to make you angry. Because unlike the other practices we've discussed, this one never really ended. It just went underground. Let's keep going. Here's the difference between history and the present. History feels safe. We can look back at women painting lead on their faces or eating arsenic and think, thank God we're past that. We can feel superior, evolved, enlightened. We can shake our heads at their foolishness from the comfort of our modern informed perspective. But what if I told you that right now, at this very moment, women are using a beauty product that's just as deadly as anything we've discussed? What if I told you that this product is available on Amazon, on eBay, in shops in your own city? What if I told you that the beauty industry using this poison is worth over $30 billion and growing every single year? We're talking about mercury, and unlike everything else we've covered tonight, this story doesn't have a past tense. It's happening now, today, maybe in your neighborhood, maybe in your own home. And the scariest part, the women using these products often know they're dangerous. They just don't have a choice, or at least they don't feel like they have a choice. Welcome to the ongoing catastrophe of mercury skin lightening products. This is where history becomes present, where the lessons we thought we'd learned turn out to be lessons we never actually learned at all. Let me start by telling you about Fatoumata. Her name means shining one in her native language, which is either tragically ironic or perfectly fitting, depending on how you look at it. Fatoumata was 28 years old in 2019 when she moved from Mali to Minneapolis, Minnesota. She was smart, educated, spoke 3 languages, had a degree in accounting. She had dreams of building a life in America, of bringing her younger siblings over, eventually of making her parents proud. But when she arrived in Minneapolis, she noticed something. The lighter-skinned women, the white women, the light-skinned black women, the Asian women, with naturally pale complexions, they seemed to get treated better. Better jobs, better service in stores, more attention, positive attention from men. Fatoumata's skin was a beautiful deep brown, the colour of rich earth, of mahogany of midnight. But in this new country it felt like a liability. So when a friend told her about a cream that could lighten her skin, make her more acceptable, she bought it. The cream came in an unmarked jar. No ingredients list, no warnings, no brand name, just a white paste that smelled faintly metallic. Her friend said it worked faster than anything else. That should have been a red flag. But Fatoumata was desperate to fit in, desperate to succeed, desperate to feel like she belonged. She used the cream twice a day for 11 months. In 2020, Fatoumata was admitted to a Minnesota hospital. She was confused, disoriented. Her joints were swollen and painful. Her face was swollen almost beyond recognition. She couldn't remember things that had happened hours earlier. Tests showed that her kidneys were failing. Her urine mercury levels were 170 times higher than normal. The cream she'd been using contained ammoniated mercury at concentrations nearly 20,000 times higher than the FDA limit. She had been rubbing concentrated poison into her skin twice a day for almost a year. Fatoumata survived barely. She spent months in treatment. Her kidneys never fully recovered. She'll need monitoring for the rest of her life. The cream did lighten her skin in patches, giving her an uneven, scarred appearance that no amount of treatment will ever fully fix. And the cruelest irony of all, the lightening wasn't even permanent. As soon as she stopped using the cream, her natural skin tone began returning. In the areas that weren't scarred anyway. She traded her health, her kidneys, her cognitive function for a few months of slightly lighter skin. And she's one of the lucky ones. She lived. Let's talk about what mercury actually does, because the science here is both fascinating and horrifying. Mercury exists in several forms, but the one used in skin lightening products is inorganic. Mercury, usually mercuric chloride, mercurous chloride, also called calomel or ammoniated mercury. These compounds interfere with an enzyme called tyrosinase, which is essential for producing melanin, the pigment that gives skin its colour. Block tyrosinase and you block melanin production. Less melanin means lighter skin. It's actually remarkably effective, which is exactly why it's so popular. Mercury-based lightening creams work better and faster than almost any alternative. That's the problem, because mercury is also one of the most toxic heavy metals known to science. And when you apply it to your skin day after day, it does several terrible things. First, it's absorbed through your skin directly into your bloodstream. Not all of it, maybe 2% to 10% depending on the formulation, but that's more than enough. Mercury accumulates in your body because you can't efficiently excrete it. It builds up in your kidneys, your liver, your brain. Second, mercury-containing creams release mercury vapor. Yes, vapor. The mercury literally evaporates off your skin, and into the air around you. You breathe it in, your family members breathe it in, your children breathe it in. Mercury vapor is one of the most dangerous forms of mercury exposure because it goes straight to your brain. There was a case in California in 2012. A woman using mercury cream contaminated her entire apartment building. The hallways tested positive for mercury contamination. Her neighbors' children showed elevated mercury levels in their blood. None of them had ever used the cream themselves. They'd just been breathing the same air. Think about that. You can poison not just yourself, but everyone around you just by trying to lighten your skin. The health effects of chronic mercury exposure are extensive and devastating. Let me walk you through what happens. Early symptoms are subtle: fatigue, irritability, difficulty concentrating. Easy to ignore, easy to blame on stress or lack of sleep. You might develop a metallic taste in your mouth. Your gums might bleed a little. Still nothing that screams mercury poisoning. Right. Then comes the kidney damage. Mercury is particularly toxic to kidneys. You might develop nephrotic syndrome, a condition where your kidneys leak protein into your urine. Your face and feet swell with fluid. You feel constantly tired. In severe cases, your kidneys fail completely and you need dialysis or a transplant. Neurological symptoms follow. Tremors in your hands that you can't control. Memory problems: you forget words, forget what you were doing. Forget conversations you just had. Personality changes: you become anxious, depressed, paranoid. In extreme cases, you have seizures or lose consciousness entirely. Your skin, ironically, gets worse. Mercury causes hyperpigmentation in patches, dark spots that are actually harder to treat than your original skin tone. You might develop a condition called mercury-induced leukoderma, permanent white patches, where the mercury has destroyed melanocytes completely. Your skin becomes a patchwork of colours like a poorly printed photograph. And then there are the long-term effects. Mercury exposure is linked to increased risk of kidney cancer. Brain damage can be permanent memory and cognitive function that never fully return. Women who use mercury creams while pregnant pass the mercury to their babies, causing developmental delays, cognitive impairments, and birth defects. Oh, and mercury can make you sterile, just in case the kidney failure and brain damage weren't enough. But the cream does lighten your skin for a little while before it destroys you. Now here's the part that should make you furious. This isn't new information. We've known mercury is toxic for literally thousands of years. The Roman architect Vitruvius wrote about mercury poisoning in workers in the 1st century BCE. That's over 2,000 years ago. In 2013, the international community created the Minamata Convention on Mercury, a global treaty specifically designed to protect human health and the environment from mercury. Article 4 of that convention explicitly prohibits manufacturing, importing, or exporting cosmetics containing more than 1 part per million of mercury. 1 part per million. That's the absolute maximum legal limit. In 2019, the World Health Organization tested skin lightening products from around the world. Want to guess what they found? Products containing mercury levels of 10,000 ppm, 30,000 ppm, the highest tested at over 50,000 ppm. That's 50,000 times the legal limit. These products aren't accidents. They're not mistakes. They're intentionally manufactured with deadly levels of mercury, because mercury works better than anything else, and manufacturers can make more money selling effective poison than safe alternatives. And where are these products sold? Everywhere. Small beauty shops in immigrant communities, online marketplaces, international websites. In 2022, the Zero Mercury Working Group tested products from Amazon and eBay. Nearly half the skin lightening creams they bought contained mercury levels over 1,000 ppm. You can buy mercury poison on Amazon right now, probably with Prime shipping. But here's what really breaks my heart about this story. The women using these products aren't ignorant. They're not stupid. They know about mercury, they've seen the warnings, they've heard the stories, they use them anyway. Because the alternative, living with dark skin in a world that treats dark skin as inferior, feels more dangerous than mercury poisoning. Let me be very clear about what's happening here. This is colonialism's longest-lasting crime. For centuries, European colonizers spread across the world teaching people that white skin is superior, that European features are the standard of beauty, that darkness is ugly and inferior and wrong. They left. Most colonies gained independence decades ago. The soldiers went home, the governors and administrators departed. But the poison they injected into cultures worldwide, the idea that lighter is better, that stayed. That's still here, and it's still killing people. In India, the skin lightening industry represents 50% of the entire skincare market. 50%. Half of all skincare spending goes to making brown skin look less brown. In parts of Africa, studies show that up to 77% of women use skin lightening products. In Jamaica, it's over 50%. In Malaysia, the Philippines, and East Asian countries where people already have relatively pale skin, the market is booming. The global skin lightening industry was worth $8.8 billion in 2020. It's projected to reach nearly $12 billion by 2026. That's billion with a B. $12 billion spent on teaching people that their natural skin color isn't good enough. And a significant portion of those products contain mercury, lead, or hydroquinone at dangerous levels. We're talking about an industry that's literally killing its customers for profit. Let me tell you about a program that ran in Minneapolis in early 2023. A health educator named Amira Adawe herself, a Somali immigrant who'd seen the devastation mercury creams caused in her community, got funding to do outreach at Carmel Mall, a major hub for East African immigrant communities. Her team spent 3 months there. They talked to vendors. They talked to customers. They tested products using handheld X-ray fluorescence analyzers, devices that can detect mercury without destroying the product. They tested over 900 products. More than 70% contained dangerous levels of mercury, the highest tested at 33,000 ppm. These products were sold in regular shops mixed in with legitimate cosmetics. Many came from Pakistan, some from Africa, some from Asia. Most had no ingredient labels, or the labels were deliberately misleading, listing brightening agents or natural extracts instead of mercury compounds, the vendors. Most of them had no idea their products contained mercury. They were shocked when shown the test results. Some cried. They hadn't meant to poison their customers, they just stocked what people asked for, what sold well. But here's the thing that Amira keeps emphasizing in her advocacy work. The vendors aren't the problem. The customers aren't the problem. The problem is a system that makes dark-skinned women feel so worthless, so undesirable, so unemployable, that mercury poisoning seems like an acceptable risk. You want to stop mercury skin lightening. Don't educate women about mercury toxicity. They already know. Change the world that makes them feel like they need lighter skin to survive in it. There's a 24-year-old woman in London, I'll call Amara, not her real name, because she's still dealing with the health consequences and doesn't want her identity public. Amara's story illustrates something crucial about how this industry works. Amara is British-born, university-educated, modern in every way. She knew mercury was toxic, she'd studied chemistry in school. But when she was 21 and struggling to get job interviews despite strong qualifications, a relative suggested that her too dark skin might be the problem. The relative gave her a cream. No label, just a white paste in an unmarked jar. Amara asked what was in it. Her relative said, natural ingredients, traditional African remedy, very safe. Amara was skeptical. She researched online but couldn't find much information. The cream had no brand name to search for. She asked in a few beauty forums and got responses saying these traditional creams were fine, that Western regulations were just racist attempts to stop African beauty practices. So she used it. For 6 months, her skin did lighten. She also started having headaches, joint pain, and difficulty concentrating. When she finally saw a doctor and got tested, her mercury levels were dangerously elevated. The cream her relative had given her with love, with good intentions, trying to help, contained mercury chloride at levels that would make it qualify as hazardous waste if you tried to throw it away. Amara's now dealing with permanent kidney damage at 24. But here's what she told the researcher who interviewed her. I'm angry at the person who made the cream. I'm angry at the system that made me feel like I needed it. But I can't be angry at my aunt. She was just trying to help me survive in a world that treats dark skin as a liability. That's the tragedy of this whole situation. It's not individual villains. It's systems of oppression running so deep that even their victims perpetuate them out of love, trying to protect each other. You might be wondering, why don't governments just crack down harder? Why not arrest people selling these products? They're trying, sort of. The FDA in the United States has an import alert that allows agents to detain skin-lightening products at the border. They've seized thousands of products over the years. But the FDA has limited resources and limited authority. They can't test every product that comes into the country. They can't regulate products sold within immigrant communities. They don't have the manpower. And there are language barriers and trust issues. Many immigrant communities are wary of government agencies for good historical reasons. And even when they do seize products, it barely makes a dent. For every shipment they catch, 10 more get through. For every shop they shut down, 2 more open. And the internet has made everything worse. You can order mercury creams from overseas websites that aren't subject to US law. The Minamata Convention is great on paper, but enforcement is patchy at best. Countries that signed the treaty aren't necessarily enforcing it vigorously. Manufacturing countries often look the other way. Importing countries can't inspect everything. It's a global problem requiring coordinated global action, and we can't even agree on climate change. You think we're going to solve mercury cosmetics. Meanwhile, women keep buying these products, keep using them, keep getting poisoned, keep dying. There's a horrible economic equation at work here. Let me break it down for you. Mercury skin lightening products cost maybe $5 to $20. The ingredients are cheap, mercury is actually relatively inexpensive in bulk, and the rest is just carrier cream. So manufacturers can make huge profits selling cheap products that work really well. Safe alternatives like vitamin C serums, koic acid, alpha-arbutin are more expensive to manufacture and don't work as quickly. They take months to show results, they're subtler, and they cost more for consumers. So from a market perspective, if you're a low-income woman who desperately wants lighter skin, you're choosing between option A, spend $50, $100 on safe products that might not work for months. Option B, spend $10 on mercury cream that works in weeks. If you're living paycheck to paycheck, if you think lighter skin might help you get a better job or a better marriage, if you're under enormous social pressure to lighten, which option do you pick? The same one Fatoumata picked. The same one Amara picked. The same one millions of women pick every year. Because poverty makes you vulnerable to exploitation. And the beauty industry knows this and exploits it ruthlessly. Let me tell you the most infuriating thing about this entire situation. We could stop this. Right now. Today. We have the technology to test products. We have the scientific knowledge to make them safe. We have the legal frameworks to regulate them. We could shut down this industry in a matter of years if we actually tried. But we don't. Because the women dying from mercury cosmetics are mostly poor women of colour, immigrant women, women in developing countries, women without political power or economic clout. If white middle-class American women were dropping dead from mercury in their skincare, we'd have congressional hearings and emergency FDA regulations and 60 minutes investigations. But they're not. So we don't. That's the brutal truth. Some lives are treated as more valuable than others. Some suffering matters more than other suffering. And the skin lightening industry, it thrives in that inequality. It's built on it. It profits from it. There are people fighting back, though. Activists like Amira Adawe and her Beautywell project. Researchers documenting the scope of the problem. Healthcare workers in affected communities doing education and outreach. Survivors sharing their stories to warn others. And slowly, very slowly, there's progress. Some major retailers have pulled skin lightening products from their shelves entirely. Some countries have strengthened their regulations. Some cultural movements are trying to combat colorism, teaching people to love their natural skin. But it's not enough. It's nowhere near enough. Because the fundamental problem isn't mercury. It's colorism. It's racism. It's the global hierarchy that puts white skin at the top and everything else below. Until we fix that, really fix it, not just pay lip service to it, women will keep poisoning themselves. They'll keep risking kidney failure and brain damage and death for a chance at lighter skin. Because in a world that treats dark skin as inferior, that's not vanity. That's survival. And that's the legacy of colonialism that no independence movement could erase. That's the poison that's harder to remove than any mercury. If you're watching this and you use skin lightening products or you know someone who does, please get them tested. Mercury testing is simple, usually just a urine test. If you're using products without clear ingredient labels, especially products marketed in immigrant communities or bought online, please stop. Please see a doctor. Your skin is beautiful. The colour you were born with is beautiful. I know the world might not treat you that way. I know you face discrimination and colorism and 1,000 small cuts every day. I know that lighter skin might open doors that are currently closed, but mercury will close the door on your life. Permanently. You deserve better than poison. You deserve a world that values you as you are. And until we have that world, you deserve at least to survive with your health intact. We're 5 stories deep now into this night of deadly beauty. We've covered a millennium of women suffering from Renaissance Europe to modern Minnesota. But you know what? We haven't talked about yet. We haven't talked about the moment when science and beauty collided in the most disastrous way possible, when humanity discovered something so powerful, so miraculous, that we immediately started putting it in face cream without understanding that miracles can kill you. We need to talk about radium. We need to talk about what happens when the cutting edge of science becomes the cutting edge of vanity. Because in the 1920s and 30s, women were rubbing radioactive material on their faces and calling it skincare. And this story, this one glows in the dark. Literally. Let's continue into the radioactive nightmare of beauty. Sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones that sound like truth. In 1898, Marie and Pierre Curie discovered radium, a miraculous element that glowed in the dark that seemed to hold the secrets of the universe, that promised to revolutionize medicine and science. They won a Nobel Prize, they became international heroes, and within 3 decades companies were putting radium in face cream and telling women it would make them beautiful forever. They weren't technically lying. Radium would stay in your body forever. It would also destroy your bones from the inside out, rot your jaw until it fell off your face and give you cancer that would kill you slowly and painfully. But hey, your skin would look luminous. Literally, you'd glow right up until you died. This is the story of what happens when capitalism meets cutting-edge science meets beauty standards. Spoiler alert, women die. They always do. To understand why anyone thought putting radioactive material on their face was a good idea, we need to talk about the early 20th century's bizarre relationship with radiation. Because in the 1920s and early 1930s, radiation wasn't scary, it was magical. Marie Curie had just revolutionized our understanding of physics and chemistry. Radium was being used to treat cancer early. Radiotherapy was showing promising results for certain tumors. Scientists were discovering that radiation could kill, bacteria could preserve food, could do all sorts of amazing things. And here's the key point: nobody really understood how dangerous it was yet. They knew radiation could burn skin if you got too much exposure. Marie Curie herself had radiation burns on her hands from handling radioactive materials, but they thought small amounts were not just safe, but actually beneficial. There was this whole pseudoscientific movement claiming that low-level radiation was good for you. It would energize your cells, improve your circulation, make you healthier, stronger, more vibrant. They called it radiation hormesis, the idea that a little bit of poison is medicine. It's the same logic people use today for things like homeopathy or crystal healing. The dose makes the poison, they said. Small amounts of something dangerous can be therapeutic, except with radiation it's not true. There is no safe dose of radiation. Any exposure increases your cancer risk. Period. But they didn't know that yet. Or maybe they knew but didn't care, because there was money to be made. Enter a man named Dr. Alfred Curie. Now before we go further, I need to tell you something important. Dr. Alfred Curie was not related to Marie and Pierre Curie in any way whatsoever. Not even distantly. He just happened to have the same last name, and he exploited that coincidence ruthlessly. In 1932, Dr. Alfred Curie, whose actual medical credentials are questionable at best, founded a company in France called Thoradia. The name was a combination of thorium and radium, the 2 radioactive elements that were the star ingredients in his cosmetics line. Thoradia marketed a full range of beauty products: face creams, face powders, rouge lipstick, soap, even toothpaste. All of them contained thorium chloride and radium bromide. All of them were radioactive. All of them were sold as cutting-edge scientific skincare. The advertising was brilliant in a horrifying sort of way. The ads featured elegant women alongside scientific-looking diagrams. They talked about cellular vitality and activating tissue regeneration. They claimed that the radioactive ingredients would firm up skin, cure boils and pimples, even out redness and pigmentation, erase wrinkles, stop aging, and help retain the freshness and brightness of the complexion. One ad literally said, Thoradia cream based on the radiance formula of Dr. Alfred Curie following the discoveries of his illustrious namesake. See what he did there? He never claimed to be related to Marie Curie, but he phrased it so people would assume he was. It's like if someone named Steve Jobs, not the Apple guy, just someone with that name started selling computers and following in the footsteps of the late great Steve Jobs in his ads. It's dishonest, it's manipulative, and it worked beautifully. Thoradia wasn't alone. There were dozens of radioactive cosmetics brands in the 1920s and 30s. In Germany there was Doramad radioactive toothpaste, which promised to make your teeth shine with radioactive brilliance. In the United States there was Radiocosmetics. In Britain there were radium-infused bath salts that wealthy women would dissolve in their bathwater and soak in for hours. Radium spas became fashionable vacation destinations. You could visit health resorts where you drink radium-infused water, bathe in radium-enriched pools, even breathe in radon gas in special inhalation chambers. It was the wellness industry of its day, expensive, exclusive, and quietly killing its customers. The rich and fashionable flock to these treatments, because if Marie Curie, a Nobel Prize winner, one of the most brilliant scientists of the era, worked with radium, surely it must be safe, right? Surely these companies wouldn't sell dangerous products. Surely the government would stop them if they were harmful. Oh, you sweet summer children of the 1920s. Regulations, consumer protections. Those were barely a thing. Companies could sell whatever they wanted and make whatever claims they pleased. Caveat emptor was still the rule of the day. Let me tell you what radium actually does to your body, because it's important to understand just how insidious this poison is. Radium is chemically similar to calcium. Your body literally can't tell the difference. So when you ingest radium, or when it's absorbed through your skin, your body treats it exactly like calcium. And where does your body store calcium? In your bones. So radium gets deposited in your bones and teeth, and there it stays. Radium has a half-life of about 1/600 years, which means it takes 1/600 years for half of it to decay. For practical purposes, once radium gets into your bones, it's there forever. And while it's there, it's continuously emitting radiation. Alpha particles, beta particles, gamma rays, all shooting through your bone tissue, damaging DNA, killing cells, creating mutations. Your skeleton becomes a radioactive cage, slowly destroying you from the inside. The first symptoms might not appear for months or even years. That's part of what made radium so dangerous. The delay between exposure and illness meant people didn't make the connection. You'd use radioactive face cream for a year, feel fine and think, see perfectly safe. Then 5 years later, you'd start feeling tired all the time. Your bones would ache, your teeth would loosen, then things would get worse. Your bones would become brittle and break easily. You'd develop anemia because your bone marrow, where blood cells are made, was being destroyed by radiation. You'd be constantly sick, constantly exhausted, and nobody would know why. And if you'd been exposed to enough radiation, your jaw would literally rot off your face. It's called radium jaw, or phosphorus necrosis, and it's exactly as horrible as it sounds. The bone tissue dies and becomes infected. Your jaw crumbles, your teeth fall out. Your face develops holes that never heal. Eventually you develop cancer, bone cancer usually, or leukemia, or multiple kinds of cancer at once because radiation doesn't discriminate. It damages all your DNA, and any of those damaged cells could turn cancerous. And then you die. Painfully. While doctors stood around mystified about what could possibly be wrong with you. The most famous victims of radium weren't beauty consumers, they were workers. The radium girls, as they came to be known, were young women who worked in factories painting watch dials and instrument panels with radium-based luminescent paint during and after World War I. Their supervisors told them the paint was harmless. They were instructed to lick their paintbrushes to keep them pointed, a technique called lip pointing. They'd put the brush in their mouth, lick it to a fine point, dip it in radium paint. The tiniest numbers on watch faces, then lick the brush again, over and over all day long. Some of the women thought the radium paint was fun. They'd paint their nails with it so their hands would glow in the dark. They'd paint their teeth for parties, then smile with glowing mouths. They were teenagers and young women in their 20s having fun with this magical glowing paint, not knowing they were slowly killing themselves. Within a few years they started getting sick. Their teeth fell out. Their jaws disintegrated. They developed anemia, bone fractures, and horrific necrosis. Many died agonizing deaths in their 20s and 30s. The company that employed them, the United States Radium Corporation, denied any responsibility. They claimed the women were dying of syphilis, trying to slander them as promiscuous to avoid liability. They hired scientists who testified that radium was harmless. They fought the lawsuits for years, but the radium girls fought back. Despite being sick and dying, despite living in an era when women's testimony was often dismissed, they sued, and they won. Not all of them lived to see the verdict, but they won. Their case helped establish workers' rights to sue employers for occupational diseases. They literally changed labor law while dying of radiation poisoning. Their story is heartbreaking and heroic, and it's also directly relevant to our story because if factory workers were dying from radium exposure, what do you think was happening to women rubbing radioactive cream on their faces? Here's the thing the radium beauty product manufacturers knew about the radium girls. The cases were in newspapers, the lawsuits were public. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, it was becoming increasingly clear that radium was dangerous. But the beauty companies kept selling their products. They'd make minor adjustments, lower the radium content slightly, change the formulation, rewrite the ads to be slightly more vague. But they didn't stop. There was too much money at stake. Though radio was sold until the 1960s, the 1960s, that's well after we understood radiation after Hiroshima and Nagasaki after nuclear weapons testing, had made the dangers of radioactivity abundantly clear to the entire world. And yet you could still buy radioactive face cream in French pharmacies. Other countries banned radioactive cosmetics. Earlier, the United States cracked down in the 1930s and 40s after the Radium Girls cases made it politically impossible to ignore the dangers. Britain followed suit. But enforcement was inconsistent, and some countries were much slower to act. And even after products were officially banned, old stock remained on shelves for years. Women who'd bought these creams kept using them. They'd paid good money after all, and the cream seemed to work. Why waste it just because of some new regulations? It's estimated that tens of thousands of women used radioactive cosmetics during their peak popularity. How many of them died from radiation-related illnesses we'll never know, because most of them died decades later, long after they'd stopped using the products and the connection was never made. They got bone cancer in their 50s and 60s, and their doctors never thought to ask, "Did you use radioactive face cream 30 years ago?" Why would they? It seemed absurd, but it happened. It definitely happened. Can I tell you the most chilling detail about Thoradia cream? In 2013, a team of scientists tested old, unopened jars that had been sitting in storage for decades. The cream was still radioactive. After 80-plus years, you could still measure the radiation coming off it. Those jars are now stored as low-level radioactive waste. That's what women were putting on their faces. Radioactive waste. Beauty cream that's classified as hazardous material. And the women who used it, they're buried in cemeteries all over Europe and America. Their bones are still radioactive. If you exhume their bodies today, and some have been exhumed for research purposes, Geiger counters would click when brought near their skeletons. They're literally radioactive corpses, forever, because they wanted to look young. Try to think of a more perfect metaphor for the beauty industry. I'll wait. Here's what frustrates me most about the radium story. It didn't have to happen. The science was there. The warnings were there. The evidence was there. But profit won over safety and marketing won over truth. And women died. Does that sound familiar? It should. It's the same story as arsenic wafers. The same story as mercury creams. The same story as every deadly beauty product we've discussed tonight. The pattern is always the same. New product promises revolutionary beauty benefits. Women buy it because they're desperate to meet impossible standards. Evidence emerges that the product is dangerous. Manufacturers deny delay and keep selling. Eventually, regulations catch up, but not before thousands have been harmed. A new dangerous product emerges and the cycle starts again. We never learn. We just keep poisoning women and calling it beauty. There's an irony to the radium story that I find almost funny in a dark way. You know what radioactivity actually does to skin? It destroys it. Radiation causes DNA damage, which leads to premature aging wrinkles, sunspots, and skin cancer. It does the exact opposite of what these creams promised. Marie Curie's hands were scarred and burned from handling radioactive materials. She knew radiation damaged tissue, she'd seen it firsthand. And yet, because she was famous for working with radium, her name or a similar name was used to sell radioactive cosmetics that did exactly what she knew: radiation did destroy skin. Marie Curie died in 1934 of aplastic anemia, almost certainly caused by her prolonged exposure to radiation. She spent her final years weak and sick, her immune system destroyed. And even as she was dying, companies were using her legacy to sell radioactive face cream. She couldn't even sue or speak out against them because in the 1930s you couldn't really sue for that kind of thing. And I doubt she had the energy given that she was dying from radiation exposure herself. The real Marie Curie died from her scientific work. Fake Dr. Curie made a fortune. The women who bought his products died unnecessarily. There's something almost biblical about that injustice the innocent suffer while the fraudulent profit. Now I know what you're thinking. Okay, but we wouldn't fall for that now. We know about radiation. We learned from this. Did we though? Because in the 1980s there was a brief fad for negative ion products that were lightly radioactive. In the 2000s, some alternative medicine circles promoted radon therapy for arthritis and other conditions. Even today you can buy products online claiming that beneficial radiation or natural radioactive minerals will improve your health. It's the same scam with updated marketing, and people still fall for it. The truth is we're not any smarter than the women who used Thoradia cream in 1935. We're just lucky that most of our beauty products aren't actively radioactive. Most. There have been cases in the past decade of cosmetics contaminated with radioactive materials, usually accidentally from contaminated raw ingredients. But the fundamental dynamic hasn't changed. We still believe companies that tell us their products will make us beautiful. We still ignore warning signs when we desperately want something to work. We still prioritize appearance over health. The substances change. The story doesn't. You want to know something that keeps me up at night? Marie and Pierre Curie's research papers are still radioactive. Their cookbooks, their furniture, even the walls of their laboratory all still measurably radioactive over a century later. They're stored in lead-lined boxes in France's National Library, and researchers who want to access them have to sign liability waivers and wear protective equipment. That's how long radiation lasts. That's how permanently dangerous it is. And for a few decades in the early 20th century, women rubbed it into their faces. Because beauty is supposed to hurt, right? Beauty requires sacrifice. Beauty demands suffering. Except beauty shouldn't demand your bones crumbling from the inside out. Beauty shouldn't require cancer. Beauty shouldn't mean death. But it did. And it does. And unless we change something fundamental about how we value women, it always will. The radium girls, those factory workers who painted watch dials, they've become something of a symbol in recent years. There have been books about them, plays, movies. Their story is taught in schools as a cautionary tale about corporate negligence and the importance of workers' rights. But the women who used radioactive cosmetics, they're forgotten. No books, no movies, no memorials. They're just gone. Radioactive skeletons in unmarked graves, their stories lost to history. Maybe it's because they were consumers rather than workers. Maybe it's because they weren't organized, didn't sue, didn't fight back publicly. Maybe it's because women who bought face cream doesn't sound as sympathetic as young women poisoned by their employers. Or maybe it's because we still don't want to admit how much the beauty industry has gotten away with. Because acknowledging that thousands of women died from cosmetics means acknowledging that thousands more might be dying from cosmetics right now, and we'd have to do something about it. And doing something would be expensive. It would require regulations. It would cut into profits, so instead we forget. We move on. We tell ourselves it was a long time ago and things are different now. Are they, though? I'll tell you what's different. We have better science now. Better regulations in most countries. Better consumer protections. The FDA in the United States has authority over cosmetics, at least in theory. The European Union has strict cosmetics regulations. But here's what hasn't changed: the beauty industry is still largely self-regulated. Companies don't have to prove their products are safe before selling them. The FDA doesn't pre-approve cosmetics the way they pre-approve drugs. Testing is often minimal or non-existent, and new ingredients are being introduced all the time: nanoparticles, synthetic compounds, ingredients with long-term effects we don't understand yet. In 20 years, we might look back at something we're using now and think, how did we not know that was dangerous? Because the Theradia users didn't know either. The arsenic eaters didn't know. The mercury cream users didn't know. Or they knew, but hoped they'd be fine. Hope they'd be the exception. Hope that beauty would be worth the risk. Hope isn't a safety protocol, but it's all most consumers have. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this story, it's this: science is not automatically safe. Scientifically proven doesn't mean harmless. Radiation was scientifically proven to exist. That didn't make it safe to rub on your face. Question everything, especially things that sound too good to be true. Especially things marketed with scientific-sounding language designed to impress rather than inform. Especially things that promise miracles, because miracles usually come with a cost. And the beauty industry has proven over and over again across centuries that they're perfectly willing to let you pay that cost with your health, your life, whatever it takes, as long as they profit. Your safety is not their priority. Your beauty, or rather your pursuit of it, is what makes them money. If those two things conflict, we know which one they'll choose. We've covered a lot of ground now: poison painted on faces, dropped in eyes, eaten rubbed on skin, embedded in bones. But there's one more category of deadly beauty we need to discuss before we continue beauty that doesn't involve chemicals or toxins at all. Beauty that's purely mechanical. We need to talk about what happens when you physically reshape the body, not with binding or breaking, but with compression so extreme that your organs move, your ribs crack, and breathing becomes an achievement. We're about to discuss corsets, but not the fashion history you think you know. We're talking about corsets taken to extremes, about the Victorian wasp waist that required literal ribcage deformation, about electric corsets that promised health while delivering nerve damage. This is where beauty becomes a cage, not metaphorically, but literally. Stay with me. Take a deep breath. Go ahead, really do it. Fill your lungs all the way, feel your ribs expand, feel your chest rise. Feel how good that feels, how natural, how automatic. Now imagine you can't do that. Imagine every breath is shallow, restricted, measured. Imagine your ribs are compressed in a vice that never releases, squeezing tighter every day until the bones themselves begin to warp and bend. Imagine fainting is just part of your daily routine, not because you're sick, but because your body literally cannot get enough oxygen while you're wearing your clothes. That was normal life for millions of Victorian women. Not torture, not punishment, just fashion. Welcome to the world of extreme tight lacing, where the goal wasn't just to look slimmer, it was to achieve a waist so impossibly small that it defied human anatomy. And spoiler alert, when you defy human anatomy fights back, and usually wins, even if it takes decades. Let's start with some context, because corsets themselves aren't the villain here. Humans have been using supportive undergarments for centuries, from ancient Greek breastbands to medieval bodices. For most of history, these garments were practical, they supported the back, helped distribute the weight of heavy clothing, provided structure under fashionable silhouettes. A reasonable corset, properly fitted and worn without extreme lacing, isn't harmful. Women worked in them, rode horses in them, lived full active lives in them. The corset itself isn't the problem. The problem is what happened in the 19th century, when the ideal waist size became physically impossible for most adult women to achieve. When fashion magazines advertised 14-inch waists and some claimed 12 inches or even less. When having a waist you could encircle with your hands became the ultimate status symbol. For context, the average adult woman's natural waist is somewhere between 26 and 32 inches depending on body type and size. A 14-inch waist is roughly the size of a 7-year-old child's waist. On an adult woman with adult hips and an adult rib cage, achieving that measurement requires more than just pulling tight laces. It requires deformation, and that's exactly what happened. The technology that made extreme tight lacing possible was actually an innovation that seemed beneficial at the time, metal eyelets. Before the 1820s, corset laces went through hand-stitched holes in fabric, which limited how tight you could pull them before the fabric ripped. But in 1823, someone invented the metal eyelet, a reinforced grommet that could withstand much more tension. It's like the difference between tying a rope to a piece of cloth versus tying it to a metal hook. One tears, the other doesn't. And suddenly women could lace their corsets tighter than ever before, cinching their waist to previously impossible dimensions. The fashion magazines loved it. They published illustrations of women with waists barely thicker than their necks, waists that looked like they'd been carved with a knife, waists that made the silhouette look like a wasp, all curves above and below with an impossibly narrow middle. The wasp waist became the ideal, and millions of women suffered to achieve it. Here's how extreme tight lacing actually worked. You'd start young sometimes, as young as 12 or 13, right as girls hit puberty. The idea was to train the body while it was still growing to mold it like clay before it hardened into adult bone structure. You'd wear your corset all day, every day. You'd sleep in it, maybe a slightly looser sleeping corset, but still restrictive. And every few weeks or months you'd have it tightened another inch, then another, gradually compressing your ribcage, pushing your organs around, creating a new shape that was artificial, but permanent. Because here's the thing about extreme tight lacing, after a few years you can't take the corset off anymore. Not without support. Your back muscles have atrophied from disuse, the corset has been doing their job for so long that they've weakened. Your organs have shifted position, your ribcage has been reshaped. Without the corset you'd struggle to even stand upright. You become dependent on the thing that's destroying you. How's that for a metaphor? Let me tell you about the physical consequences, because they were extensive and horrifying. First, the obvious: you can't breathe properly. A tightly laced corset compresses your lungs, reducing their capacity by up to 30% or more. You take shallow breaths, you can't exert yourself. A brisk walk leaves you gasping. Climbing stairs feels like running a marathon. And fainting. Fainting was so common among fashionable ladies that it became romanticized. Smelling salts were an essential accessory. Fainting couches became popular furniture. Literature and art from the period are full of delicate women swooning gracefully into men's arms. Except there's nothing romantic about losing consciousness, because your brain isn't getting enough oxygen. That's not delicacy, that's hypoxia. That's your body shutting down non-essential functions because it's literally being suffocated. Then there are the internal organ problems. Your liver, stomach, intestines, they all need to fit somewhere. When you compress your waist by 6 or 8 or 10 inches, those organs don't just magically shrink. They get pushed. They get squeezed. They end up in places they're not supposed to be. Women suffered from chronic indigestion, constipation, and what the Victorians delicately called digestive disturbances. They couldn't eat normal-sized meals. Their stomachs were compressed to the point that a few bites would leave them uncomfortably full. Many existed in a semi-starved state, not by choice, but because their bodies physically couldn't process more food. Their livers got pushed down and back, their intestines got compressed. Some women developed hernias, organs actually pushing through weakened muscle walls because they had nowhere else to go. And pregnancy in a tightly laced corset was a nightmare. Many women continued wearing their corsets while pregnant, just gradually loosening them to accommodate the growing baby. But some didn't loosen enough. Miscarriages were common. Birth complications were frequent. Babies were sometimes born with deformities or underdeveloped because they'd been compressed in the womb by their mother's corset. But here's where it gets truly horrific: the bones. Your ribs are bones. They're flexible to a degree, especially when you're young, but they're still bones. They're not meant to be permanently compressed. When you tight-lace consistently for years, especially starting in adolescence, your ribs adapt. And by adapt, I mean they deform. The lower ribs, the floating ribs that aren't attached to your sternum, they bend inward. They curve at unnatural angles. In extreme cases, they actually overlap each other like tiles on a roof. The spaces between your ribs narrow or close completely. We know this because archaeologists have excavated Victorian-era cemeteries and found skeletal evidence of extreme corseting. There's a famous case from the early 2000s. A skeleton of a 19th century Englishman was excavated, and his ribs showed dramatic deformation, consistent with years of tight corseting. Wait, did I say Englishman? Yes. Because here's a plot twist: men wore corsets too. Not as commonly as women, and often for different stated reasons, orthopedic support or medical purposes, but the skeletal evidence doesn't lie. Some men were tight-lacing just like women, maybe for fashion, maybe for those oh-so-important medical reasons, maybe because the same beauty standards that crushed women weren't leaving men entirely free either. That skeleton I mentioned, the archaeologists initially thought it must be a woman because of the rib deformation. Then they did more tests and realized it was male. The study authors noted that it might have been an orthopedic corset, but they specifically added corset used to obtain a fashionable silhouette cannot be ruled out. Even men weren't immune to the tyranny of the wasp waist. Now you might be thinking surely doctors spoke out against this. Surely medical professionals saw the damage and tried to stop it. Oh, they did. Victorian medical journals are full of articles about the dangers of tight lacing. Doctors documented the organ damage, the breathing difficulties, the skeletal deformations. They published papers with titles like The Evils of Tight Lacing and The Corset, a Medical Necessity or a Social Evil, and women largely ignored them. Because those same doctors were men, and many of them were the ones perpetuating the beauty standards that demanded tiny waists in the first place. It's hard to take health advice seriously from someone who tells you corseting is dangerous, but also that an 18-inch waist is most attractive. Plus, doctors in the Victorian era had their own corset-adjacent industry going. They designed and sold orthopedic corsets and medical support garments that were basically just corsets marketed differently. These were supposed to be healthier, more scientific, better for your spine. Were they? Not really. They still compressed. They still restricted. They just cost more and came with a doctor's recommendation. It's like how today's shapewear is marketed as smoothing and contouring rather than restrictive, even though it's doing basically the same thing corsets did just with modern materials. We haven't actually rejected compression garments, we've just rebranded them. Speaking of modern technology meeting corsets, let me tell you about one of the most bizarre Victorian inventions, the electric corset. In the 1880s and 1890s, electricity was the hot new technology that everyone was excited about. It seemed magical, powerful, scientific. And just like with radium, a few decades later, entrepreneurs immediately started putting electricity in everything, including corsets. Electric corsets came in various designs, but the basic concept was this: a normal corset with a small battery or electromagnetic coil sewn into it. Some had wires running through the fabric, some had metal plates. They were advertised as providing therapeutic electrical currents that would cure everything from nervous debility to female troubles to paralysis to digestive complaints. One advertisement from 1883 for Scott's electric corset claimed, "Their therapeutic value is unquestioned, and they quickly cure in a marvelous manner nervous debility, spinal complaints, rheumatism, paralysis, numbness, dyspepsia, and all other diseases peculiar to women." All other diseases peculiar to women. That's code for, we have no idea what's wrong with you, but we're pretty sure we can sell you something for it. Did electric corsets cure anything? Of course not. Did they cause additional problems on top of the normal corset issues? Absolutely. Women reported electric shocks, burns, skin irritation, and increased discomfort. The batteries were unreliable, they'd leak, corrode, stop working after a few weeks. But they sold well because they combined two things Victorians loved: fashion and pseudo-scientific medical technology. It's the 19th century equivalent of those waist trainers that claim to be revolutionary because they have copper threads or far infrared technology, or whatever nonsense marketing term is trendy. The technology changes. The scam remains the same. Here's a question I want you to think about. How many Victorian women knew they were damaging their bodies but did it anyway? Because it's tempting to assume they just didn't know better, that they were innocent victims of a less informed time. But that's not entirely accurate. Medical information was available. The risks were published. Women who tight-laced for years could feel the damage, the constant discomfort, the difficulty breathing, the digestive problems. They knew. They just didn't have a choice. Or rather, the alternative, being considered unfashionable, unmarriageable, undesirable, seemed worse than organ damage and difficulty breathing. There's a letter from 1859 published in a women's magazine from a young woman who wrote, "I know the tight lacing injures me. I can feel my health failing and my mother begs me to loosen my stays, but when I do I look so stout and ungainly that I cannot bear to be seen. I would rather suffer and be admired than be comfortable and despised." Read that again. I would rather suffer and be admired than be comfortable and despised. That's the choice she was given. That's the choice millions of women were given. And can we really blame them for choosing admiration? In a world where a woman's value is determined almost entirely by her appearance and her marriageability, where an unmarried woman was a social burden and an object of pity, where being considered attractive could mean the difference between security and destitution, can we really blame them? They made a rational calculation in an irrational system, and their bodies paid the price. There's another dimension to the corset story that doesn't get talked about enough, class. Wealthy women could afford well-made corsets custom-fitted by professionals made with quality materials. They had maids to help them dress and undress, to adjust the lacing gradually and carefully. They could afford to rest when they felt faint. They could afford doctors if complications arose, working-class women. They wore cheap, mass-produced corsets that didn't fit properly. They had to lace themselves, often pulling too tight too fast because they didn't know better or didn't have help. They couldn't rest when they felt faint. They had work to do, children to care for, households to manage. And they couldn't afford doctors. The same fashion standard affected all women, but it killed poor women faster and more frequently than rich ones. Sound familiar? It's the same pattern we've seen with every dangerous beauty practice. Mercury creams affect everyone, but poor women can't afford treatment for mercury poisoning. Arsenic wafers were marketed to all women, but wealthy women could afford alternatives. The system is designed to exploit everyone, but it exploits the vulnerable most viciously. Let me tell you about a woman named Ethel Granger. She holds the Guinness World Record for the smallest waist on a woman in history, 13 inches. 13 inches. Ethel lived in the 20th century. She was born in 1905 and died in 1982. This isn't ancient history. This is recent enough that photographs exist. You can see her tiny waist, her dramatically exaggerated hourglass figure. But here's the disturbing part. Ethel didn't tight-lace for fashion or beauty standards. She did it because her husband wanted her to. He was obsessed with body modification, and over the course of their marriage he convinced her to undergo increasingly extreme modification, not just tight-lacing, but also piercings, including septum piercings before they were socially acceptable, and other modifications. The tight-lacing started when Ethel was in her 20s. It took years to achieve that 13-inch waist. She wore her corset 24/7, tightening it gradually. By the time she was middle-aged, her waist measurement was smaller than most people's thighs. Medical experts who examined photographs of her said her internal organs must have been severely displaced. She likely had chronic pain, digestive issues, and breathing difficulties. But in interviews later in life, Ethel said she'd enjoyed the attention, that she'd been proud of her record, that it had made her feel special. That's heartbreaking, right? That she internalized her husband's obsession to the point where she was proud of her own deformation, that she found validation in the thing that was destroying her body. But is it really that different from modern women who get validation from meeting beauty standards that require starvation surgery or suffering? Is it different from anyone who bases their self-worth on their appearance? Ethel just took it to the extreme. But extreme exists on a continuum, and most of us are somewhere on that same spectrum. The age of extreme tight lacing officially ended around World War I. Not because women suddenly decided their health mattered more than fashion, but because the silhouette changed. The fashionable look of the 1920s was straight and boyish, no curves, no waist emphasis. Corsets went out of style, replaced by more flexible foundation garments. But here's the thing, the corset never really went away, it just evolved. We have shapewear now, Spanx and their countless competitors. We have waist trainers that celebrities promote on Instagram claiming they'll give you an hourglass figure. We have compression garments marketed as postpartum recovery aids or fitness tools when really they're just corsets by another name. The technology is different, the materials are modern, but the purpose is the same: reshape your body to fit a standard that isn't your natural shape. And yes, modern shapewear is generally less dangerous than Victorian extreme tight lacing. Most people aren't wearing it 24/7 or lacing it tight enough to cause organ damage. Most people can breathe in it, probably, mostly. But the fact that we even need these garments, the fact that looking like our natural shape is considered unacceptable, the fact that we're still willing to be uncomfortable all day to look thinner, that hasn't changed at all. You know what I find most tragic about the corset story? The women didn't even look good in them, or at least not as good as the illustration suggested. Because those fashion magazine illustrations, they were artistic ideals, not reality. The illustrators would draw waists impossibly small and hips impossibly wide to create a dramatic contrast. No actual woman, no matter how tightly she laced, looked like those drawings. But women tried anyway. They compared themselves to impossible illustrations and found themselves lacking. They laced tighter, suffered more, damaged their bodies further, all in pursuit of a standard that literally could not be achieved, because it was based on artwork, not actual human bodies. Does that sound familiar? It should. Because we're doing the exact same thing with Instagram and photoshopped magazine covers and filtered photos. We're comparing our real bodies to images that aren't real, and destroying ourselves trying to match them. The technology is different. The impossibility is the same. If you take nothing else from this story, take this: your body is not meant to be reshaped. Your organs are in the right place. Your ribs are the right shape. Your waist, whatever size it naturally is the right size. Any fashion that requires you to deform your skeleton is not fashion. It's violence. Any beauty standard that requires you to rearrange your organs is not a standard. It's torture. And any system that makes you believe your natural body is unacceptable is not protecting you. It's exploiting you. Victorian women didn't have the freedom to reject corsets. But you do. You can refuse to wear shapewear. You can refuse to squeeze into clothes that don't fit. You can refuse to accept that your body needs to be compressed, contained, or reshaped. You can just breathe. Fully, deeply, the way your lungs were designed to work. It's revolutionary, really. Breathing. What a concept. We're deep into this night now, and we've covered so much suffering. Poisons, radiation, broken bones, compressed organs. But there's one more mechanical torture we haven't discussed yet, one that combined the latest technology with age-old vanity. One that promised to be safe because it was medical scientific cutting edge. One that gave women cancer decades later because nobody thought to test whether bombarding your body with radiation for hours was maybe not a great idea. We need to talk about X-ray hair removal. We need to talk about what happens when the beauty industry gets access to radiation before anyone understands what radiation actually does. Because radium in face cream is bad, but X-rays aimed at your body for 20 hours straight. That's a special kind of catastrophe. Let's continue. Progress is supposed to make things better, safer, easier. That's the promise of technology, right? Each new discovery should improve our lives, protect us from harm, move us forward into a brighter future. Except sometimes progress gives us new and creative ways to destroy ourselves. And sometimes we embrace those ways with open arms and closed minds because they come wrapped in the language of science and modernity and advancement. In 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen discovered X-rays. Within 30 years, beauty salons were using them to remove unwanted hair. Within 40 years, women were developing cancer from those treatments. Within 50 years, doctors finally admitted what should have been obvious from the start. Maybe bombarding people's bodies with radiation for hours at a time isn't actually a good idea. But by then it was too late for thousands of women. The cancer was already growing. The damage was already done. And all because someone looked at a revolutionary medical imaging technology and thought, you know what? This would be great for removing leg hair. Let me set the scene. It's the 1920s. Women's fashion is changing dramatically. Hemlines or rising skirts that had covered ankles for centuries are suddenly showing calves. Sleeveless dresses are becoming acceptable. The flapper look is all about showing more skin than women had shown in public for generations. Which created a new problem: visible body hair. Hair that nobody had worried about before because nobody saw it. But now if you're wearing a dress that shows your legs, suddenly people notice if you have dark hair on your calves. If you're wearing a sleeveless dress to a party, people see your underarm hair. And the beauty industry, as always, was ready to turn natural human biology into a problem that needed solving. Preferably a problem that needed expensive, repeated solving. Traditional hair removal methods existed, of course. Shaving, waxing, tweezing, chemical depilaceries that burned the hair off and sometimes burned your skin too. But these were temporary solutions. The hair always grew back. Women had to keep doing it over and over. But then in the early 1920s, someone noticed something interesting. Patients receiving X-ray treatments for other conditions were losing hair in the areas that were irradiated. Cancer patients getting radiation therapy would lose the hair on their heads. Patients being X-rayed for diagnostic purposes would sometimes lose patches of hair. And instead of thinking, that's a worrying side effect, someone thought, that's a business opportunity. The logic seemed sound at the time. Here's how they thought about it. X-rays could penetrate the skin and target the hair follicle. If you aimed X-rays at an area with unwanted hair and gave it enough exposure, you could destroy the hair follicles permanently. The hair would fall out and never grow back. Problem solved. One treatment, permanent results. It sounded miraculous. It sounded scientific. It sounded modern and sophisticated and like something wealthy, fashionable women would pay good money for, so that's exactly what happened. Clinics and beauty salons began offering X-ray hair removal, also called X-ray epilation, as a cosmetic service. They advertised it as safe, effective and permanent. They called it the modern woman's solution to an age-old problem. The procedure went something like this. You'd go to a clinic or salon. A technician, not a doctor, not a radiologist, just someone who'd been briefly trained to operate the equipment, would position an X-ray machine near the area where you wanted hair removed. Your face if you wanted to remove facial hair. Your underarms, your legs. Sometimes your entire legs from thigh to ankle. Then they'd turn on the machine and you'd sit there, and sit there, and sit there for hours. Because here's the thing: to permanently destroy hair follicles with X-rays you needed a lot of radiation. Much more than a diagnostic X-ray. We're talking about radiation exposure that was 20 times, 50 times, sometimes hundreds of times higher than a medical X-ray. Early treatments required patients to sit in front of the X-ray machine for up to 20 hours. 20 hours! Sometimes split over multiple sessions, but still, that's an enormous amount of time being bombarded with radiation. Let me tell you about a woman named Helen. Her story was documented in a medical journal in 1953, but the events happened in the 1920s. Helen was 19 years old in 1926 when she went to a beauty salon in New York City for X-ray hair removal on her face. She had some dark hair on her upper lip and chin that bothered her, and she'd heard about this new permanent solution. The salon technician positioned Helen's face in front of the X-ray machine and turned it on. Helen sat there for 4 hours while radiation poured into her face. The technician gave her no protective equipment, no lead apron, no shielding, nothing. Just 4 hours of direct X-ray exposure to her face. Helen went back for 3 more sessions over the next month. That's 12 hours total of facial X-ray exposure. The hair did fall out just as promised. Her skin looked smooth and hair-free. She was thrilled. She told all her friends about it. Some of them got the treatment too. 20 years later, in her late 30s, Helen noticed a small sore on her cheek that wouldn't heal. Then another one on her chin. Then a rough patch on her upper lip where the skin felt thick and leathery. She went to a doctor. The diagnosis was skin cancer. Multiple basal cell carcinomas on her face, all in the exact areas that had been exposed to X-rays 2 decades earlier. Helen underwent surgery to remove the cancerous tissue, then more surgery when the cancer came back, then more. By the time the medical journal documented her case in 1953, she'd had 17 separate surgeries on her face. 17. And the cancer kept returning because the radiation damage to her skin was permanent. The cells were permanently damaged, permanently prone to becoming cancerous. Helen died in 1959 at age 52, not from old age, from complications related to the facial cancers that had plagued her for over 20 years, all because at 19 she wanted to get rid of some hair on her upper lip. Helen's story wasn't unique. Medical literature from the 1940s and 50s is full of case studies of women who'd received X-ray hair removal in the 1920s and 30s and were now dealing with the consequences. The cancers typically appeared 15 to 30 years after the X-ray exposure, which made it really easy for the beauty industry to deny responsibility. That treatment was decades ago, they'd say. How can you prove the cancer is related? Maybe she just got cancer naturally, but researchers could prove it, because the cancers appeared in very specific patterns exactly in the areas that had been irradiated. If a woman had X-ray treatment on her face, she got facial cancers. If she had treatment on her legs, she got leg cancers. The pattern was undeniable. A study published in the 1970s tracked down women who'd received X-ray hair removal treatments decades earlier. They found that 35% of them had developed cancer in the irradiated areas. 35%. 5. More than 1 in 3 women who got this treatment eventually got cancer from it. 35% cancer risk for cosmetic hair removal. Think about that. Would you play Russian roulette with a revolver that had 6 chambers and 2 bullets? Because that's better odds than 1 in 3. But these women didn't know they were playing Russian roulette. They were told the treatment was safe. They were told it was scientific. They were told it was better than the messy temporary alternatives. They were lied to. Now you might be wondering, didn't anyone realize X-rays were dangerous? Didn't scientists and doctors know about radiation risk by the 1920s? Yes and no. By the 1920s, there was definitely some awareness that high doses of radiation could be harmful. Medical professionals had seen radiation burns. They'd noticed that radiologists who worked with X-ray machines all day sometimes developed health problems. But there was still this pervasive belief that small or moderate doses of radiation were either harmless or possibly even beneficial. That whole radiation hormesis concept we talked about, with radium cosmetics, that was still popular thinking in the 1920s. Plus, there was financial incentive to ignore the risks. X-ray hair removal was lucrative. Salons could charge premium prices. Equipment manufacturers made money selling X-ray machines. Nobody wanted to admit that they'd been selling a service that was slowly killing people. And crucially, the regulations didn't exist. In the 1920s and early 1930s, there were no laws about who could operate X-ray equipment or how much radiation exposure was safe. Anyone could buy an X-ray machine and start offering treatments. No medical license required. No training required. No oversight required. It was the Wild West of radiation exposure, and women's bodies were the frontier being colonized. The American Medical Association started warning about X-ray hair removal as early as 1929. They published articles with titles like, "In their endeavor to remove a minor blemish, they have incurred a major injury." Minor blemish. They were talking about unwanted hair that grows on literally every adult human body. Natural, normal hair. That's what women were told was a blemish that needed removing, even at the cost of massive radiation exposure. The AMA warning said that X-ray hair removal could cause severe skin damage, ulceration, scarring, pigmentation changes, loss of skin elasticity, and cancer. They said the procedure should be banned for cosmetic purposes, but did salons stop offering it? No. Did women stop getting it? Not immediately, because the medical warnings were competing against aggressive advertising campaigns from beauty companies that insisted the treatment was safe, and people wanted to believe the advertisements because the alternative traditional hair removal was annoying and time-consuming. It's easier to believe a comfortable lie than an inconvenient truth, especially when the truth won't become apparent for decades. The decline of X-ray hair removal happened gradually through the 1930s and 1940s. Some states started regulating who could operate X-ray equipment. Some cities banned cosmetic use of X-rays. Insurance companies started refusing to cover the procedures. And most importantly, the medical evidence became overwhelming and undeniable. By the 1950s, X-ray hair removal was essentially extinct in the developed world. But the damage had been done. Thousands of women, maybe tens of thousands, will never know the exact number had been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. and many of them would spend the rest of their lives dealing with the consequences. Here's what really gets me about this story: the technicians. The people operating those X-ray machines in beauty salons. Many of them had no idea what they were doing. They'd been given maybe a day or two of training, basically. This is how you turn it on. This is how you position it. This is how long to leave it on. They didn't understand radiation safety. They weren't wearing protective equipment themselves. They weren't monitoring radiation doses. They were just following instructions from their employers trying to make a living. And many of those technicians got sick too. Cancer rates among early X-ray technicians were horrifically high. They were being exposed to radiation every single day, multiple times a day, with every patient they treated. So it wasn't just the patients who were victims, it was the workers too. Both groups exploited by an industry that prioritized profit over safety, that rushed to market with a dangerous technology before understanding its risks, that lied about safety to protect their bottom line. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Can I tell you about one of the most infuriating aspects of this whole disaster: the alternative treatments? Because even while X-ray hair removal was at its peak, there were safer alternatives. Electrolysis using an electric current to destroy individual hair follicles had been around since the 1870s. It was time-consuming and required skill, but it was safe and effective. But electrolysis required multiple sessions treating one hair at a time. It was slow. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't have the appeal of cutting-edge technology. X-ray hair removal, on the other hand, could treat large areas at once. It seemed faster, more modern, more scientific. It was marketed as the superior option, and women chose it because who wouldn't want the faster, more modern solution? Especially when you're being told by advertisements and salespeople that it's completely safe. This is a pattern we've seen throughout this entire night. The dangerous option is marketed as the better option. The poison is sold as the cure. The harm is disguised as help. And by the time the truth comes out, the damage is already done and the profits have already been made. There's a woman I want you to know about. Her name was Mildred Trotter, and she's not famous, but she should be. Mildred was an anatomist and physical anthropologist. In the 1940s, she started researching the effects of X-ray exposure on human tissue. She tracked down women who'd had X-ray hair removal decades earlier and documented their injuries. She testified before regulatory bodies about the dangers. She published papers that provided crucial evidence linking X-ray cosmetic treatments to cancer. Mildred Trotter didn't make money from her research. She didn't become famous. She just did the scientific work necessary to prove what the beauty industry didn't want, proven that they'd been harming people for profit. There should be more people like Mildred Trotter. There should be more scientists willing to do research that threatens powerful industries. There should be more people willing to speak uncomfortable truths. But research like hers doesn't get funding easily, because the beauty industry has money and scientists trying to prove beauty treatments are dangerous don't. The system is designed to protect profits, not people. Now let's talk about the modern era, because you might think we've learned our lesson that we'd never do something like X-ray hair removal again, and you'd be partly right. We don't use X-rays for hair removal anymore. That's been thoroughly discredited and banned. But we do use lasers, and electrolysis, and IPL intense pulsed light. We have new technologies for permanent hair removal, and they're generally much safer than X-rays. Modern laser hair removal, when done properly by trained professionals, has a good safety record. But here's the thing, when done properly by trained professionals is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because laser hair removal is still largely unregulated in many places. In some states in the US, anyone can buy a laser device and start offering hair removal services with minimal or no training. There have been cases of burn scarring and eye injuries from improperly performed laser treatments. There have been cases of unlicensed practitioners using equipment they don't understand, causing permanent damage to clients. Is it as bad as X-ray hair removal? The technology is inherently safer, but the regulatory gaps are similar. The profit motive is the same, and the willingness to cut corners on safety to make more money that hasn't changed at all. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine if in 1925 X-ray beauty salons had been required to give their clients informed consent. A document that said, "This procedure involves exposing you to radiation levels 100 times higher than a medical X-ray." We don't fully understand the long-term effects, but there is evidence that high radiation exposure can cause cancer skin damage and other health problems. You might develop cancer in 20-30 years from this treatment. Do you consent? How many women would have gone through with it if they'd been given that information? I'm guessing not many. The beauty industry knew this. That's why they didn't provide that information. They provided advertisements instead, glossy images of smooth, hair-free skin testimonials from satisfied customers, reassurances from experts that the treatment was safe. They sold the dream and hid the nightmare. And we're still doing this. Maybe not with X-rays, but with so many other beauty treatments and products. How many people know all the risks of the procedures they're getting? How many people truly understand what they're consenting to when they get fillers or surgery, or even just use certain skincare products? We've gotten better at disclosures and consent forms, sure, but we still market the dream more than we warn about the reality. If you search online today for X-ray hair removal, most of what you'll find are historical articles about how dangerous it was and how glad we are that we don't do it anymore. It's safely in the past, a cautionary tale we can shake our heads at. But I wonder what we're doing now that people in 2050 or 2100 will look back on with the same horror. What current beauty practice will future generations study as evidence of our barbarism? Will it be cosmetic surgery complications that could have been avoided? Will it be long-term effects of microplastics in beauty products? Will it be something we haven't even identified as dangerous yet? Because I guarantee you there's something. There's always something. Some poison we're not seeing, some risk we're not taking seriously, some harm we're normalizing. The pattern doesn't end. It just evolves. Helen, the woman I told you about earlier, who got X-ray hair removal on her face at 19, she gave an interview near the end of her life. The interviewer asked if she regretted the treatment. Helen said, "I regret that I was lied to. I regret that I trusted people who didn't deserve trust. I regret that I was so worried about some hair on my face that I risked my life. But mostly I regret that we live in a world where a 19-year-old girl thinks facial hair is a problem worth solving at any cost." At any cost? That's the trap, isn't it? Beauty at any cost. Acceptance at any cost. Fitting in at any cost. Until the cost comes due and you realize what you actually paid. Helen died before she could see the world change in ways that might have made her feel better about her choices. She died before laser hair removal was invented, a technology that could have given her what she wanted without giving her cancer. She died before body hair on women became slightly more accepted, before some women started proudly not shaving and not caring what anyone thought. She died still paying the price for wanting to look acceptable in 1926. We're more than halfway through our journey now, and I know this is heavy. I know it hurts to hear these stories, to think about all this suffering, to realize how little has truly changed. But we're not done yet. Because so far we've talked about beauty practices from Asia, Europe, and America. We've covered centuries of history. But there's one beauty tradition we haven't touched, one that's ancient, meaningful, and deeply controversial. One that I need to handle very carefully because it's still practiced today in cultures that value it differently than Western culture does. We need to talk about kohl eyeliner, ancient Egyptian beauty that's still being used, lead-based makeup that crosses millennia, a cosmetic that's simultaneously cultural heritage and public health hazard. This is where history and culture and safety collide in ways that don't have easy answers. Let's continue with sensitivity and truth. Sometimes the most dangerous things are the ones that last, not because they're effective, but because they're traditional, because they're cultural, because they're wrapped in history and meaning and identity, and criticizing them feels like attacking the people who use them. This is one of those stories, and I need you to understand something before we go further. I'm not here to judge anyone's culture or traditions. I'm not here to be superior or condescending, or to act like Western beauty practices are somehow better. We've spent the entire night documenting how Western beauty standards have killed people for centuries, but I am here to tell the truth. And the truth is that kohl eyeliner, that iconic, ancient, beautiful eye makeup that's been used for over 5,000 years, is often made with lead. And lead poisoning doesn't care about tradition. Lead poisoning doesn't care about cultural significance. Lead poisoning just poisons. This is the story of how something sacred can still be dangerous, how something meaningful can still cause harm, and how the conversation around it requires nuance, respect, and honesty in equal measure. Let's start at the very beginning, ancient Egypt around 4000 BCE. The pyramids haven't been built yet. Writing is just being invented, and Egyptian people, men, women, children, are lining their eyes with a dark powder called kohl or medameh. If you've ever seen ancient Egyptian art, you know the look, those dramatic elongated eye lines. That striking contrast of black against skin, it's iconic, it's beautiful, is one of the most recognizable aesthetic elements of ancient Egyptian culture. And it wasn't just decorative. The ancient Egyptians believed kohl had protective properties. It would shield their eyes from the harsh desert sun, prevent eye infections, and ward off the evil eye. Some of these beliefs had merit. The dark colour around the eyes does reduce glare, like how modern athletes put black grease under their eyes. And some formulations of kohl actually did have mild antibacterial properties. But here's the problem. Traditional kohl is made by grinding up a mineral called galena, and galena is lead sulfide. It's literally a lead ore. The main ingredient in traditional kohl is lead. The ancient Egyptians were grinding up lead and applying it directly to their eyes, every single day, for their entire lives. Now, did they know lead was toxic? No. The science of toxicology didn't exist yet. They knew some substances were poisonous if you ate them, but they didn't understand cumulative toxicity or heavy metal poisoning. They just knew that kohl made their eyes look beautiful and felt protective. And to be fair, the amount of lead exposure from eye makeup alone probably wasn't enough to cause acute poisoning in most cases. These weren't people eating lead or inhaling lead fumes. It was skin contact around the eyes. The absorption rate is relatively low. But relatively low doesn't mean zero. And when you're applying lead-based makeup every day for decades, it adds up. Here's where this gets complicated. Kohl didn't stay in ancient Egypt. It spread across the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. It became embedded in multiple cultures. For thousands of years, it's been used in religious ceremonies, in wedding rituals, applied to babies as protection used by men and women of all ages. In many cultures, applying kohl to a baby's eyes isn't vanity, it's tradition. It's what your grandmother did, what her grandmother did going back generations. It's protective, spiritual, cultural. And in many modern formulations, kohl is safe. Modern commercial kohl, the kind you buy in stores in developed countries, is usually made with safer alternatives like charcoal iron oxides or other non-toxic pigments. It's regulated, tested, labelled with ingredients. But traditional kohl homemade kohl bought from certain markets or imported from countries with less stringent regulations that still often contains lead, sometimes lead sulfide, sometimes other lead compounds, sometimes mixed with antimony, another toxic heavy metal. Studies conducted in the 2000s and 2010s by the FDA and WHO tested kohl products from various countries. They found that up to 80% of traditional kohl samples contained dangerous levels of lead. Some contained lead at levels so high that they'd be classified as hazardous waste if you tried to throw them away. Let me tell you about Amira. Her name has been changed, but her story is real, documented in a CDC report from 2012. Amira was 18 months old, living in New York City with her family who had immigrated from Yemen. She was a happy, active toddler. Her grandmother, who lived with them, would apply a small amount of traditional kohl to Amira's eyes every morning, just a tiny bit as protection. It's what the grandmother had done for her own children, what had been done to her as a child. Amira started having developmental delays. She wasn't hitting her milestones. She was unusually tired, unusually irritable. Her parents took her to a pediatrician, worried something was wrong. Blood tests showed that Amira had lead poisoning. Her blood lead level was 45 micrograms per deciliter, a level considered very dangerous, especially for a young child. For reference, there is no safe level of lead in children's blood, but anything above 5 micrograms per deciliter is considered elevated and concerning. The doctor asked about possible sources of lead exposure: old paint in the apartment, lead pipes, imported pottery. The parents couldn't think of anything. Their apartment was new. They didn't use any unusual ceramics. Where was the lead coming from? Finally, someone thought to ask about the kohl. The grandmother brought in the small jar she used. It was homemade kohl sent by relatives still living in Yemen, made the traditional way. Testing showed it was 84% lead by weight. 84%. It was basically lead powder with some colouring and oil added to make it spreadable. The grandmother was heartbroken. She'd been trying to protect her granddaughter, and instead she'd been slowly poisoning her. She didn't know. Nobody in her family had ever known. They'd been using this same kohl for generations, applying it to babies' eyes as a blessing, never knowing it was causing harm. Amira recovered after they stopped using the kohl, and she underwent treatment for lead poisoning, but she had been exposed during critical developmental windows. Lead poisoning in early childhood can cause permanent cognitive impairments, learning disabilities, and behavioural problems. It's too early to know if Amira will have long-term effects, but the risk is there. All because of tradition, all because of a grandmother's love. all because nobody thought to question what had always been done. This is where the conversation gets difficult, and I need you to stay with me here. Because it would be easy to say, well, just stop using coal, problem solved. But that's not realistic, and it's not respectful of the cultural significance these practices hold. For many communities, particularly immigrant communities, maintaining cultural traditions is a way of preserving identity. When you're in a new country, where everything is different, where you might face discrimination or pressure to assimilate, holding on to your cultural practices, including beauty practices, is a way of staying connected to your heritage. Telling someone, stop using coal, can feel like telling them, abandon your culture, especially when Western beauty practices are everywhere, when Western standards dominate, when you're already being pressured to look more. Western dress, more Western, be more Western. So the conversation can't be, your tradition is stupid and dangerous. The conversation has to be, your tradition is valuable and here's how to practice it safely. The good news is that this is absolutely possible. Modern safe coal exists. Coal made with charcoal, made with iron oxide, made with manganese or other non-toxic pigments. Coal that looks the same, applies the same, has the same dramatic effect, but won't poison anyone. The bad news is that many people don't know this option exists or don't have access to it, or don't trust it because it's not traditional. There's also a massive labelling problem. Many products sold as coal or kajal or surma, different names for essentially the same thing, don't have ingredient labels or have misleading labels. A product might say natural ingredients without mentioning that one of those natural ingredients is galena. Lead sulfide is natural technically. So is arsenic. Natural doesn't mean safe, and products imported from certain countries often don't meet the safety standards of the countries they're imported to. They slip through regulatory cracks. They're sold in small ethnic markets that don't have the resources or knowledge to verify safety. They're brought in by individuals returning from overseas visits, homemade products shared as gifts. The system isn't set up to prevent this kind of harm. Here's what lead poisoning from coal actually looks like. Because the effects are serious and worth understanding. In children, lead poisoning can cause developmental delays, learning difficulties, behavioral problems, hearing problems, and slowed growth. It affects brain development in ways that can be permanent. Children's brains are particularly vulnerable to lead because they're still developing, and lead interferes with that development process. In adults, lead poisoning can cause headaches, abdominal pain, constipation, memory problems, mood disorders, joint pain, high blood pressure, and reproductive problems. In pregnant women, lead can cross the placenta and harm the developing fetus. In men, lead exposure can reduce sperm count and cause fertility problems. And here's the insidious part lead accumulates in the body. Your body stores it in bones and teeth where it can remain for decades. Even small amounts of daily exposure add up over years. You might not notice any symptoms for a long time, and then suddenly you have health problems that seem to come out of nowhere. There was a case in 2016, a woman in her 50s living in California, originally from Pakistan. She'd been using traditional coal every day since she was a teenager. That's over 35 years of daily lead exposure around her eyes. She started having symptoms, chronic fatigue, joint pain, memory problems, mood changes. Multiple doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. Eventually someone tested her blood lead level. It was elevated. They tested her coal. It was loaded with lead. But here's the tragic part: by the time they identified the source, she'd already been exposed for decades. The lead was stored in her bones. Even after she stopped using the coal, she'd have lead in her system for the rest of her life. Some of the damage, particularly the neurological effects, might be permanent. 35 years of daily poisoning, all from eye makeup. Now let's talk about babies. Because in many cultures, applying coal to infants' eyes is traditional, sometimes immediately after birth. And this is where the danger is most acute. Babies and young children are far more vulnerable to lead poisoning than adults. Their brains are developing rapidly. Their bodies are smaller, so the same amount of lead has a much bigger impact. They absorb lead more readily through their skin and gastrointestinal tract. And babies being babies touch everything. They rub their eyes, they get the coal on their hands, they put their hands in their mouths. So even though coal is applied to the eyes, babies often end up ingesting it too. There have been multiple documented cases of infants developing severe lead poisoning from coal application. Some required hospitalization, some developed seizures. Some suffered developmental delays that may affect them for life. In 2010, the FDA issued a specific warning about applying Col Kajal or Surma to children. They recommended that parents not use these products on children at all, and that if adults choose to use them, they should first verify that the product doesn't contain lead. But how do you verify that most people don't have access to lead testing equipment? You can't tell by looking at it or smelling it. If the label doesn't list ingredients, and many don't, you have no way to know. The safest approach is to only use commercial coal products from regulated manufacturers that list their ingredients and certify they're lead-free. But that requires access to those products and the knowledge that the traditional alternative might be dangerous. Here's the question that makes this so complicated. How do you balance respect for cultural traditions with protecting health? Because both things matter. Cultural preservation matters. Immigrant communities maintaining connections to their heritage matters. Not every traditional practice needs to be abandoned just because Western medicine says so. Western medicine has its own history of bias and harm, particularly toward communities of colour. But lead poisoning also matters. Brain damage in children matters. Chronic health problems matter. So what's the answer? I think it's education without condemnation. It's making safe alternatives available and accessible. It's approaching these conversations with respect rather than superiority. It's acknowledging that Western beauty standards have been just as deadly while offering concrete solutions. It's organisations like the CDC and WHO partnering with community leaders, religious leaders, elders, respected community members to spread awareness about lead-free alternatives. It's creating informational materials in multiple languages, distributed through channels that communities trust. It's recognising that a grandmother applying coal to her granddaughter isn't being careless or ignorant. She's following tradition, expressing love, doing what her culture has taught her, is protective. She needs information, not judgment. She needs access to safe products, not lectures about how her traditions are dangerous. Let me tell you about a program that actually worked. In 2015, health workers in Michigan, which has large immigrant populations from the Middle East and South Asia, started an initiative around coal safety. They didn't tell people to stop using coal. Instead, they partnered with local community organisations and ethnic beauty supply stores. They provided free lead testing for coal products. They educated store owners about the difference between safe and unsafe coal. They worked with suppliers to stock lead-free alternatives. They created educational materials in Arabic, Urdu, Hindi and other languages, explaining the risks of traditional coal and highlighting safe alternatives that looked and worked the same way. They recruited community health workers from within these communities, people who understood the cultural significance, who could explain the issue in culturally sensitive ways. Over 2 years, they tested over 200 coal products and found that 67% contained lead. They removed those products from stores. They connected consumers with safe alternatives. They followed up with families who had been using lead-containing coal. Blood lead levels in children from these communities dropped. Not to zero, there are other sources of lead exposure, but measurably significantly dropped. That's what success looks like. Not erasing tradition, but making tradition safer. There's a bigger lesson here about how we talk about dangerous beauty practices in different cultures. Because I've noticed something while researching this topic. When Western beauty practices are dangerous, we tend to frame it as capitalism exploiting women or corporations putting profit over safety. The system is the villain. But when non-Western beauty practices are dangerous, it often gets framed as backwards cultural practices or ignorant traditions. The culture itself becomes the villain. That double standard is harmful and inaccurate. Lead in coal is dangerous for the same reason lead in Victorian face paint was dangerous, because lead is toxic. The culture that uses it isn't the problem. The lack of knowledge about toxicity and the lack of access to safe alternatives, those are the problems. And those problems have solutions that don't require anyone to abandon their cultural identity. If you're someone who uses Col Kajal or Surma, or if you have family members who do, here's what you need to know. Check if your product lists ingredients. If it contains galena lead, sulfide lead oxide, or any form of lead, don't use it, especially not on children. If it doesn't list ingredients at all, be cautious. If possible, get your coal products tested for lead. Some health departments offer free lead testing. Some pharmacies have testing kits. Look for commercial coal products from reputable manufacturers that specifically state they're lead-free and list safe ingredients like charcoal or iron oxide. If you're applying coal to children, be extra careful. Children are much more vulnerable to lead poisoning. The safest choice is to use only verified lead-free products on children, or to skip it entirely until they're older. If you've been using traditional coal for years, especially if you've been applying it to children, consider getting blood lead levels tested. Lead poisoning can be treated, but you need to know about it first. And if you're giving coal as a gift or bringing it back from overseas, please check that it's lead-free first. The intention might be loving, but the result could be harmful. The story of coal is different from the other stories we've told tonight. It's not about corporations cynically selling poison for profit. It's not about fashion magazines promoting impossible standards. It's about genuine cultural traditions that happen to involve a toxic substance that people didn't know was toxic. But the solution is the same as it's been for everything else: knowledge, access to safe alternatives, and respect for people's autonomy to make informed choices. You can honour your heritage without poisoning yourself or your children. You can wear coal and be safe. You can maintain tradition and embrace modernity. These things aren't mutually exclusive, but you need information. You need options. You need a society that makes safe alternatives accessible, instead of forcing you to choose between your culture and your health. Ancient Egypt gave us pyramids, hieroglyphics, advanced mathematics, and dramatic eye makeup that's still iconic 5,000 years later. That's an incredible legacy. Coal is part of human cultural heritage, and it deserves to be preserved. But it needs to be preserved in forms that don't cause lead poisoning. Because there's nothing traditional about brain damage. There's nothing culturally valuable about developmental delays in children. There's nothing worth preserving about a practice that causes harm when safe alternatives exist. Honour the tradition. Update the formula. That's not cultural erasure. That's evolution. That's taking something meaningful and making sure it can be passed down to future generations without passing down poison along with it. We've travelled far tonight through millennia, across continents, through cultures and classes and time periods. We've seen so many ways that beauty has harmed women, so many poisons applied and ingested and injected in the name of appearance. But there are still a few more stories to tell, a few more practices to examine, and the next one might be the most controversial of all, because unlike everything else we've discussed, this one still has fierce defenders who will argue it's not body modification at all, it's art, it's identity, it's a choice. We need to talk about cranial deformation, about cultures that reshaped infant skulls for beauty and status, about the practice that continued into the 20th century in some places, about what happens when beauty requires changing the shape of a child's skull before they can consent. Let's continue into this final stretch with open minds and difficult questions. There's something uniquely disturbing about beauty practices that begin before memory, before language, before the child being modified has any concept of self, or choice, or consent. At least the other practices we've discussed tonight, the arsenic, the corsets, the x-rays, they happen to people old enough to understand even if they didn't fully comprehend the risks, old enough to say yes even if that yes was coerced by society. But what we're about to discuss, this happened to infants, to babies whose skulls were still soft, still forming, still growing, babies who couldn't say no, couldn't resist, couldn't understand why their heads were being bound so tightly that the bones would grow into shapes nature never intended. This is the story of cranial deformation, of intentional head shaping, of cultures across the world that looked at a baby's skull and decided it needed to be different, longer, flatter, more pointed, more prestigious. And here's what makes this story so complicated. Unlike lead poisoning or radiation exposure, cranial deformation doesn't necessarily cause physical harm. The brain adapts. People with shaped skulls lived normal lives, had normal cognitive function, and weren't in constant pain. So was it wrong? Is it wrong? That's not a question with an easy answer, but it's a question we need to ask. Let's start with the basics. What is cranial deformation and how does it work? Human babies are born with skulls that aren't fully formed. The bones of a newborn skull are separate plates connected by soft tissue called sutures. This is why babies have soft spots, fontanelles, where you can actually feel the brain pulsing beneath thin membrane. It's terrifying to new parents, but it's nature's design. The flexible skull allows the baby's head to compress during birth, squeezing through the birth canal without getting stuck or causing brain damage. But that flexibility lasts beyond birth. For the first year or two of life, a baby's skull remains somewhat malleable. The bones are still growing, still hardening, still fusing together, which means if you apply consistent pressure to a baby's skull during this period, you can change its shape. Permanently. That's what cranial deformation is. You take a baby, sometimes literally newborn, sometimes a few weeks or months old, and you bind their head. Tight cloth wrappings. Boards strapped to the forehead and back of the head. Specially shaped cradles that force the head to grow in specific directions. You keep this binding on constantly or nearly constantly, adjusting it as the baby grows for months or even years, and gradually the skull deforms, bones grow around the pressure, the head becomes elongated or flattened or pointed or whatever shape the culture values. The process doesn't damage the brain itself. The brain is remarkably adaptable and will grow to fit whatever skull shape it's given. But it does permanently change the skull structure. Once the bones fuse, the shape is set for life. Now here's what might surprise you. Cranial deformation wasn't rare. It wasn't some obscure practice in one weird culture. It was practiced on virtually every inhabited continent except Australia. Different cultures, different time periods, different methods, but the same basic idea reshaped the skull for beauty or status or identity. The ancient Maya of Mesoamerica practiced it extensively. Starting at birth or shortly after they'd bind wooden boards to babies' heads, one pressed against the forehead, one against the back of the skull. This created an elongated, sloped head shape that was considered a sign of nobility and beauty. In Maya art and sculpture, you can see this distinctive head shape depicted on rulers and elite figures. For the Maya, an elongated skull wasn't just attractive, it signaled your place in the social hierarchy. If you were high nobility, your skull was shaped. If you were common, it wasn't. You could literally tell someone's class by the shape of their head. It was a status symbol embedded in bone. The Inca and other Andean cultures did similar things, though the exact shapes varied by region and time period. Some created elongated skulls. Some created broader, flatter skulls. The specific shape communicated which group you belonged to, which region you were from, which family line you descended from. In parts of Africa, particularly among the Mangbetu people of what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, head binding created elongated skulls that were considered extraordinarily beautiful. European colonizers who encountered the Mangbetu in the 19th and early 20th centuries were both fascinated and horrified by the practice. They wrote extensively about it, usually in deeply racist and condescending terms, while completely ignoring that Europeans were doing equally strange things to their own bodies, with corsets and foot binding in China was just as extreme. In parts of France and Switzerland, rural communities practiced head binding well into the 19th century. They'd use special bonnets or caps that flattened the back of babies' heads. In some regions of Russia, similar practices continued into the early 20th century. Even in North America, some indigenous groups practiced forms of cranial modification. The Chinookan peoples of the Pacific Northwest created flattened foreheads that were considered a mark of free birth. Enslaved people weren't allowed to modify their heads, so an unmodified head marked you as lower status. Across the Pacific in Vanuatu, certain islands practiced head binding that created distinctive shapes. In parts of Asia, various forms of cranial shaping were documented historically, though less extensively than in the Americas. This wasn't one culture doing one weird thing. This was humanity across the world, across millennia, deciding that the natural human head shape wasn't quite right and needed fixing. Let me tell you about what archaeologists find when they excavate ancient burial sites in regions where cranial deformation was practiced. They find graves full of shaped skulls. Adults, children, even some infants who died before the process was complete. And the skulls are striking. If you're not expecting it, they can look almost alien. Dramatically elongated or flat in places, skulls shouldn't be flat or compressed in ways that seem impossible. But here's what they don't find evidence of widespread health problems. The people with modified skulls lived normal lifespans for their era. They didn't have higher rates of brain injury or cognitive impairment. The skull shape didn't seem to make them more vulnerable to head trauma. Their teeth developed normally. Their jaws functioned fine. From a purely physical health perspective, cranial deformation seems to have been relatively harmless. The brain adapted to the new skull shape without issue in most cases, which raises the question, if it didn't cause harm, was it really a problem? And that's where things get philosophically complicated. Let's talk about consent. Because that's really what makes this practice so controversial, isn't it? An adult can choose to modify their body. They can get tattoos, piercings, plastic surgery, whatever. It's their body, their choice. We might judge those choices, we might think they're unwise, but ultimately it's not our business. But a baby can't consent. A baby can't say, yes, I would like my skull to be elongated, please. They can't make an informed decision about permanent body modification. The parents are making that choice. For cultural reasons, for social reasons, for aesthetic reasons. They're permanently altering their child's appearance based on the values of their culture before the child can have any input. Is that different from other parenting decisions? Parents make all sorts of choices for their children, what they eat, what religion they're raised in, whether they're circumcised, what language they speak. We generally accept that parents have the right to make decisions for their children based on their cultural values, but there's something about permanent physical modification that feels different, especially modification done purely for appearance or social status. Although, is it purely for appearance in cultures where cranial deformation was practiced skull shape, communicated identity? It marked you as belonging to a specific group, a specific class, a specific heritage. It wasn't just making the baby prettier, it was giving the child a physical marker of their place in society. In some cultures, not having your skull shaped would mark you as an outsider, as low status, as unmarriageable. Parents who chose not to shape their children's skulls would be condemning them to social exclusion. Sound familiar? It's the same logic as foot binding, the same logic as tight-lacing corsets, the same logic as so many harmful practices. We're not hurting our children, we're protecting them from a society that would hurt them worse if they looked different. There's a case study I want to share with you. It comes from the 1930s when anthropologists were documenting the last remaining practitioners of cranial deformation in South America. They interviewed parents who were still modifying their children's skulls even though the practice was declining rapidly due to pressure from missionaries, government officials, and the influence of Western culture. One mother said something that stuck with the anthropologist enough that he quoted it in his report. She said, "If I don't bind my daughter's head, people will know our family is abandoning the old ways. They will think we are ashamed of who we are. They will think we want to be like the outsiders. My daughter will be neither one thing nor another, not traditional enough for our people, not modern enough for the outsiders. I bind her head so she will belong somewhere." That's not cruelty. That's love in a complicated situation. That's a mother trying to give her daughter an identity in a world where traditional identity is under threat. But it's still permanent modification of an infant's skull. It's still a choice the daughter didn't make. Can both things be true? Can it be understandable and still be wrong? I think maybe it can. Here's something most people don't know. Cranial deformation still happens. Not intentionally in most cases, but accidentally. Babies who spend too much time lying on their backs can develop flat spots on their skulls, a condition called positional plagiocephaly. It became much more common in the 1990s after the Back to Sleep campaign encouraged parents to put babies on their backs to reduce SIDS risk. The campaign worked, SIDS deaths dropped dramatically. But suddenly pediatricians were seeing a lot of babies with misshapen heads, flat on one side or the back, asymmetrical, and you know what doctors do about it. In many cases they prescribe helmets, special molded helmets that babies wear for months, applying gentle pressure to reshape the skull while it's still malleable. It's cranial modification, just in reverse. Instead of creating an unusual shape, they're creating a normal round shape. But it's the same principle, same vulnerable infant skull, same external pressure applied over months, same permanent reshaping of bone. The difference is that we call one correction and the other deformation. One is medical, one is cultural, but mechanically they're the same thing, which raises interesting questions about what we consider normal and what we consider modified. Is a round skull more natural than an elongated one? Or is natural just whatever shape occurs without intervention, whether that's round or flat or asymmetrical? Let me tell you about archaeological discoveries that changed how we think about cranial deformation. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, when archaeologists first started finding large numbers of elongated skulls in ancient burial sites, they didn't know what they were looking at. Some proposed wild theories that these were a different species of human, or evidence of ancient aliens or genetic abnormalities. But as they found more and more examples, and as anthropologists studied contemporary cultures that still practiced head binding, they realized this was intentional. This was cultural. This was something humans chose to do to themselves. More recently, DNA analysis and CT scanning of ancient skulls has revealed more details. The skull bones show patterns of stress and growth that confirm external binding. The brain cavities show no signs of damage or unusual pathology. These were normal humans whose heads had been deliberately reshaped in infancy. One particularly interesting finding in burial sites where some individuals have modified skulls and others don't. The individuals with modified skulls often have richer grave goods, better burial locations, and other markers of higher status. The skull modification really did mark social hierarchy, and here's something poignant. Sometimes archaeologists find child or infant graves where the skull is partially modified, showing that the binding had started, but the child died before the process was complete. These young deaths cut across all social classes, suggesting that even in cultures where some children's heads were shaped and others weren't, loss and grief were universal. The decline of cranial deformation practices across the world happened at different times for different reasons, but a common thread is colonization and modernization. In Mesoamerica, Spanish colonizers in the 1500s and 1600s worked to suppress indigenous practices they considered barbaric, which included cranial deformation. Catholic missionaries pressured indigenous families to stop modifying their children's heads, framing it as unchristian and primitive. In Africa, European colonizers did the same in the 19th and 20th centuries. They forbade traditional practices, set up schools that taught European values, and generally worked to erase indigenous cultural practices they didn't understand or approve of. In the Pacific Northwest, US and Canadian government policies aimed at civilizing indigenous peoples included banning cranial modification, along with many other traditional practices. The pattern is consistent. Colonizers encounter a practice that seems strange to them, label it as backwards or harmful or primitive, and forcibly suppress it, often with no real understanding of the cultural meaning or significance, often with no consideration for how this cultural erasure might harm the communities involved. And yes, cranial deformation involved modifying infants' bodies without their consent, but the forced elimination of the practice also involved cultural genocide. Both things caused harm, different kinds of harm, but harm nonetheless. So where does that leave us? What's the right way to think about cranial deformation? I don't think there's a simple answer, but I think we can acknowledge several truths simultaneously. 1. Permanent body modification of infants raises serious ethical questions about consent and bodily autonomy. 2. In cultures where cranial deformation was practiced, it served important social and cultural functions that shouldn't be dismissed as mere vanity. 3. The forced elimination of these practices by colonial powers was itself a form of violence and cultural destruction. 4. We should be very careful about judging historical or cultural practices through a purely modern Western lens, because that lens has its own blind spots and biases. 5. Understanding and respecting cultural context doesn't mean every cultural practice is beyond criticism, but criticism should come with humility and recognition that our own culture has plenty of problematic practices. It's complicated. It's messy. There's no clear villain here, just humans making difficult choices in complex cultural contexts, trying to do what they thought was best for their children and communities. You know what strikes me about cranial deformation compared to all the other practices we've discussed tonight. It's the only one that doesn't cause obvious physical harm. No poison, no radiation, no crushed organs. Just a differently shaped head. And yet it troubles us deeply. More perhaps than practices that caused actual suffering and death. Why, I think it's because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about bodily autonomy, cultural relativity, and parental rights. It's easier to condemn putting arsenic in cosmetics that's clearly poison. But condemning cranial deformation means taking a stance on whether parents have the right to make permanent aesthetic modifications to their children's bodies for cultural reasons. And that opens a whole can of worms. What about circumcision? What about ear piercing? What about raising children in religions that require specific dress or appearance? What about feeding children diets that might affect their height or body composition? Where's the line between acceptable parenting and unacceptable body modification? I don't have perfect answers to these questions. I'm not sure anyone does. But I think asking them is important. Here's what I do know across human history, across cultures. Humans have consistently looked at the natural human body and decided it needs improvement. We've bound feet, reshaped heads, scarred skin, stretched necks, filed teeth, and done countless other modifications, all in the name of beauty status or cultural identity. And we continue to do it today, We pierce our babies' ears. We circumcise our sons. We put braces on teenagers' teeth. We prescribe growth hormones to short children. We're not as different from our ancestors as we like to think. The question isn't whether we modify bodies. We do. We always have. The question is which modifications are acceptable, which are harmful, and who gets to decide. Those are questions every generation has to answer for themselves, with humility and recognition that future generations might judge our answers harshly. Cranial deformation as an intentional cultural practice has largely disappeared from the world. A few isolated communities may still practice it, but it's rare. Medical helmet therapy for positional plagiocephaly continues, but that's framed as correction rather than modification. The shaped skulls that remain are mostly in museums and archaeological collections now, silent testimony to cultures and practices that no longer exist. Looking at them, it's easy to feel superior, to think we've progressed beyond such things. But have we? We're still reshaping bodies to fit cultural ideals. We're just using different methods: surgical methods, chemical methods, technological methods. We've traded wooden boards for Botox binding cloths, for body dysmorphia cultural modification for commercial modification. The shapes we're trying to achieve are different. The tools we use are different. But the underlying impulse, the belief that the natural body isn't quite right and needs fixing, that hasn't changed at all. We're nearing the end of our journey now, and there are just 2 more stories to tell. 2 more practices to examine. And they're perhaps the strangest and saddest of all practices that were marketed as solutions, as cures, as improvements, but that violated bodies in the name of health. We need to talk about the tapeworm diet, about Victorian women who intentionally infected themselves with parasites to lose weight, about the lengths people will go to for thinness when society makes thinness the price of acceptability. This is where beauty meets pathology, where the desire to be thin becomes literal self-infestation. Stay with me. We're almost through this dark night, almost at the light. How badly do you want to be thin? What would you sacrifice for it? Your money, your time, your comfort, your dignity. Would you swallow a parasite? I know that sounds like the setup to a horror movie, and in a way it is, but this isn't fiction. This is history. This is what happens when a society becomes so obsessed with thinness that intentional infection seems like a reasonable price to pay. Welcome to the story of the tapeworm diet, one of the most grotesque, desperate, and possibly mythologized beauty practices in history. I say possibly because here's the twist: we're not entirely sure it actually happened. It might be the greatest urban legend in beauty history. Or it might be real and just so horrifying that we'd rather believe it was made up. Either way, the fact that the story exists, the fact that people believed it could be real, tells us something profound about how far we think women will go for thinness, and how far they actually do go. Let's set the scene. England, 1890s through the 1910s. This is the tail end of the Victorian era and the beginning of the Edwardian period. Fashion is changing. The ideal body type is shifting from the corseted hourglass to something slimmer, more youthful, less voluptuous. For the first time in Western history, thinness is becoming fashionable for women. Not just not fat, but actively thin, slender, willowy, a figure that requires many women to restrict their eating significantly. This is also the era when doctors and scientists are just beginning to understand metabolism, nutrition, and weight loss. They know that eating less makes you thinner, but they don't fully understand why or how to do it healthily. Weight loss advice is a chaotic mix of legitimate science and absolute quackery. And somewhere in this chaotic environment, a story emerges: you can lose weight by swallowing a tapeworm. The logic in a twisted way makes sense. A tapeworm is an intestinal parasite. It lives in your gut and absorbs nutrients from the food you eat. So theoretically, if you have a tapeworm, you can eat normally, but the worm takes some of the calories, meaning you absorb fewer calories yourself. You stay thin without having to diet. It's the ultimate cheat, the shortcut, the magic solution that lets you eat what you want and still lose weight. And if it sounds too good to be true, that's because it absolutely is. Here's where the story gets murky. Newspaper advertisements from the early 1900s exist genuine historical documents advertising sanitized tapeworms for weight loss. These ads appeared in American and British publications promising easy weight loss, with no diet, no exercise. One advertisement from around 1900 reads, "Easy way to reduce sanitized tapeworms, jar-packed. Fat, the enemy that shortens your life, comes off easily with our sanitized tapeworms. No diet, no exercise." These ads existed. They're in archives. You can look them up, so clearly someone was selling something marketed as tapeworm diet pills. But here's the question, were they actually selling tapeworms? Or were they selling fake pills and just claiming they contained tapeworms? Because we have very little evidence that real tapeworm pills were ever widely available or commonly used. We have lots of stories, lots of sensational newspaper articles warning about the practice, lots of moral panic, but actual documented cases of people intentionally infecting themselves with tapeworms for weight loss. Those are surprisingly rare in medical literature from the period. In 1912, the Washington Post ran an article titled "Tapeworm Pills for Fat People, Merely a Wild Yarn, Say Experts." Medical professionals at the time were already skeptical that this was actually happening on any significant scale. So was the tapeworm diet real? Or was it an urban legend possibly created by sensational journalism and snake oil salesmen? The honest answer is we don't know for sure, but we know that people believed it was real. We know women were afraid other women were doing it, and we know that the fear and fascination with this practice reveals something true about society's attitudes toward women's weight. Let's talk about what would actually happen if you deliberately infected yourself with a tapeworm. Because whether or not women actually did this in large numbers, the biological reality is worth understanding. Tapeworms are parasitic flatworms. Several species can infect humans, but the ones most commonly associated with the supposed diet pills are beef tapeworms or pork tapeworms. In nature, you get infected by eating undercooked meat that contains tapeworm larvae. Once inside your intestines, the larvae attach to your intestinal wall using hooks or suckers on their head. They then grow and grow and grow. A tapeworm can reach lengths of 15 to 30 feet, yes feet, living coiled inside your intestines. The tapeworm absorbs nutrients directly through its body surface. It doesn't have a digestive system of its own, it just soaks up whatever digested food is passing through your gut. So yes, technically, it does take some of your calories, but here's what else happens. You develop abdominal pain, nausea, diarrhea or constipation. You might see segments of the worm in your stool, little white rice-like pieces that are actually pieces of the worm breaking off. Pleasant, right? You become malnourished not just because the worm is taking nutrients, but because the infection damages your intestinal lining, reducing your ability to absorb nutrients. You might develop vitamin deficiencies, particularly B12 deficiency, which can cause neurological problems. The worm can grow so large that it causes intestinal blockages. It can migrate out of your intestines to other parts of your body, forming cysts in your muscles, liver, lungs, even your brain. These cysts can cause seizures, vision problems, and other serious complications. And here's the really fun part, removing the tapeworm isn't easy. You can't just take a pill that kills it and be done. If the worm dies inside you and starts to decay, it can cause severe inflammation and infection. You need to either expel the entire worm, which means using strong purgatives that induce violent diarrhea, or sometimes even surgical removal. Historical accounts describe doctors using various methods to extract tapeworms. One involved fasting the patient for days, then placing food near their mouth while they lay very still, hoping the hungry worm would crawl up the esophagus toward the food and could be pulled out. That's probably apocryphal, but it shows up in medical text from the era. More realistically, doctors would use powerful laxatives and antiparasitic drugs to force the worm out. The patient would have to examine their stool carefully to make sure the entire worm, including the head, came out, because if the head remained attached to the intestinal wall, it would just grow back. Imagine going through that intentionally. For weight loss. Let me tell you about a case that is documented. In 1909, the British Medical Journal published a case report about a woman who presented to a doctor with symptoms of a tapeworm infection. During the examination, when asked about possible sources of infection, the woman eventually admitted, reluctantly shamefully, that a friend had told her about tapeworm pills for weight loss. The friend claimed to have gotten them from a travelling salesman. The woman had purchased them, taken them as directed, and yes, lost weight. She'd also become ill, which is why she'd finally sought medical help. The doctor successfully treated her infection. In his case report, he expressed frustration that such quackery was being marketed to desperate women. But he also noted something interesting. The woman told him that many of her friends had asked where she'd gotten her miracle weight loss solution. Even after she explained about the tapeworm and how sick she'd become, some of them were still interested. Think about that. She told her friends she'd intentionally infected herself with a parasite that had made her seriously ill, that she'd had to undergo unpleasant treatment to remove it. And their response was, "Where can I get some?" That's not stupidity, that's desperation. That's what happens when society makes women feel that being thin is more important than being healthy. Now here's where the tapeworm diet story gets really interesting. From a historical perspective, we can't separate it from the moral panic about women's bodies and women's behaviour in the Victorian and Edwardian eras. A lot of the newspaper articles about tapeworm pills weren't just reporting on a dangerous health trend. They were using it as evidence of women's vanity, women's foolishness, women's willingness to risk their health for appearance. These articles would say things like vanity leads women to dangerous extremes, or ladies' folly, the tapeworm diet craze. They framed it as a moral failing, women caring too much about appearance, women being gullible and susceptible to quack remedies, women being willing to do anything to attract men. But notice what these articles never questioned: the social pressure that made women feel they needed to be thin in the first place, the beauty standards that made weight loss seem necessary, the limited options women had for earning money or achieving status outside of marriage, which made physical attractiveness a form of currency. The tapeworm diet, real or imagined, wasn't a failure of individual women's judgment. It was a failure of a society that made women's value contingent on their appearance. Here's a thought experiment. Let's say the tapeworm diet was mostly a myth. Let's say very few women actually did it, and most of the pills being sold were fake. Does that make the story less disturbing, or more? Because if it was mostly myth, that means we spent over a century believing women would do this, believing women were so desperate for thinness that they'd swallow parasites. And believing that says something about how we view women's relationship with their bodies and their appearance. It reveals an assumption that women's pursuit of beauty is pathological, irrational, that women will harm themselves in pursuit of an ideal. And while that assumption is based on real patterns, we've spent all night documenting real harm done in pursuit of beauty. The gleeful way society talks about women's foolish beauty practices is often more about mocking women than protecting them. The tapeworm diet story became a cautionary tale, a scary story, a piece of dark folklore. Can you believe women used to do that? We shake our heads, we feel superior, we convince ourselves we're more enlightened now. Meanwhile, eating disorders have the highest mortality rate of any mental illness. Weight loss surgery, which intentionally alters your digestive system, is a booming industry. Appetite suppressants that can cause heart problems are widely available. Women still die in pursuit of thinness. The methods change, the desperation doesn't. Let me tell you about something that definitely did happen and is well documented: the diet pill industry in the 20th century. In the 1930s, companies sold diet pills containing dimetrophenol or DMP, an industrial chemical that causes weight loss by literally making your cells produce heat instead of storing energy. It worked great for weight loss. It also caused overheating, peripheral neuropathy, cataracts, and death. It was banned in 1938 after multiple deaths. In the 1950s and 60s, doctors prescribed amphetamines literal speed for weight loss. They were incredibly effective. They also caused addiction, heart problems, psychosis, and death. In the 1990s, the FDA approved fen-phen, a combination of fenfluramine and phentermine, for weight loss. It was a massive success until they discovered it caused heart valve damage and pulmonary hypertension. It was pulled from the market in 1997, but not before causing serious harm to thousands of people. Even today, weight loss drugs can have serious side effects. Some cause increased heart rate and blood pressure. Some cause birth defects. Some have unknown long-term effects because they're too new. We mock the idea of Victorian women swallowing tapeworms, but we're doing the modern equivalent. We're taking drugs that alter our metabolism, our brain chemistry, our organ function, all for weight loss. The tapeworm just seems more viscerally disgusting, so we treat it as obviously foolish in a way that makes us feel superior. But is it really more foolish than taking amphetamines, than having surgery that rearranges your digestive system, than taking drugs? We don't fully understand the long-term effects of... There's a type of weight loss surgery called gastric bypass. It involves surgically creating a small pouch from your stomach and connecting it directly to the small intestine, bypassing most of your stomach and part of your intestines. The result: you can only eat tiny amounts of food before feeling full. Your body absorbs fewer nutrients from the food you do eat. You lose weight. Sound familiar? It's essentially doing surgically what a tapeworm supposedly did naturally. reducing the amount of nutrients you absorb from food. Gastric bypass is considered a legitimate medical procedure. It's covered by insurance in many cases. Doctors recommend it for people with severe obesity. It saves lives genuinely for people with life-threatening obesity-related conditions. The benefits can outweigh the risks. But it's also increasingly being marketed to people who just want to lose weight. People who are moderately overweight or even normal weight but wanting to be thinner. People who've been convinced by society that thinness is so important that surgical intervention is justified. And gastric bypass has risks, nutritional deficiencies, dumping syndrome, bowel obstructions, hernias, long-term complications that require additional surgeries. Some people die from complications. We've sanitized and medicalized intentional malabsorption. We've made it respectable. But functionally, we're still pursuing the same goal, the tapeworm diet supposedly offered eat, but don't absorb all the calories. I'm not saying gastric bypass is bad or wrong. For some people, it's a necessary medical intervention. I'm saying we should be honest about what we're willing to do for thinness and recognize that we haven't progressed as far from the tapeworm diet as we'd like to believe. Here's what I think is the real horror of the tapeworm diet story, whether it happened or not. It's not that women might have swallowed parasites. It's that society created conditions where that seemed like a reasonable option, where women were so desperate for thinness, so convinced that their value depended on being thin, so lacking in safe and effective alternatives that intentional infection could seem like a solution. That's the true villain of this story, not the women who might have done it, not even the snake oil salesman who might have sold fake pills. The villain is a social system that makes women believe they're unlovable, unemployable, worthless if they're not thin. And that villain is still here. It's in every magazine that photoshops models thinner. It's in every movie that casts only thin actresses as love interests. It's in every job interview where appearance affects hiring decisions. It's in every doctor who dismisses health concerns by saying just lose weight. It's in every family gathering where relatives comment on your body. It's in every social media post that gets more likes when the poster looks thinner. We're all still living in the world that created the tapeworm diet story. We've just gotten better at not talking about it. Can I ask you something personal? Have you ever skipped a meal to lose weight? Have you ever taken diet pills, even over-the-counter ones? Have you ever done a juice cleanse or a detox? Have you ever felt guilty for eating? If you answered yes to any of those, you're participating in the same cultural dysfunction that spawned the tapeworm diet. Not because you're foolish or vain, but because we live in a society that treats thinness as a moral virtue and eating as a sin that needs to be atoned for. The specifics change, the sickness doesn't. The tapeworm diet story mostly faded from public consciousness by the 1930s and 40s. By then, other weight loss methods were available: diet books, exercise programs, new diet pills. The supposed tapeworm pills disappeared from advertisements. But the story lived on as folklore, as a cautionary tale, as evidence of how far those vain women of the past would go for beauty. And occasionally the practice resurfaces. In the 2000s, there were internet rumors about celebrities using tapeworm pills. In 2013, an Iowa woman attempted to purchase a tapeworm online. For weight loss, health officials had to intervene. The desire hasn't gone away, it's just gone underground. Because as long as society makes thinness mandatory and achievable, thinness difficult, there will be people desperate enough to try anything, even parasites. If there's one lesson to take from the tapeworm diet, real or mythical, it's this. We need to stop treating women's desperate attempts at weight loss as individual moral failures and start recognizing them as symptoms of a sick society. Every time we mock women for foolish beauty practices, we're missing the point. The problem isn't that women are foolish. The problem is that they're responding rationally to a system that punishes them for not meeting impossible standards. You want to prevent tapeworm diets. Stop making women feel like their worth depends on their weight. You want to prevent eating disorders. Stop praising weight loss without asking how it was achieved. You want to prevent dangerous diet pills. Stop creating a culture where thinness is more valued than health. Individual solutions won't fix a systemic problem. Education won't fix a systemic problem. Warnings won't fix a systemic problem. We need to change the system. We're almost at the end of our long night together. We've travelled through centuries and continents. We've seen poison and radiation, compression and deformation, parasites and desperation. We've documented 1,000 years of women suffering for beauty. But there's one more story, one more practice to examine, and it's the one that brings us full circle back to where we started, back to Japan, back to tradition, back to beauty standards that seem incomprehensible from the outside but made perfect sense within their cultural context. We need to talk about ohaguro, about Japanese women who blacken their teeth for beauty, about what happens when beauty means the opposite of what you'd expect, about how beauty standards are always cultural, always constructed, and always enforced. This is our final story. Let's finish this journey together. What if I told you that for over 1,000 years, Japanese women painted their teeth black not by accident, not as decay, but deliberately, carefully, repeatedly, as the pinnacle of beauty and sophistication. Black teeth, on purpose, as desirable. If that sounds bizarre to you, congratulations, you've just experienced what anthropologists call cultural relativism shock. The moment when you realize that everything you think of as beautiful or ugly, attractive or repulsive is completely constructed by the culture you happen to be born into. This is our final story tonight. And it's the perfect ending because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth: there is no universal beauty. There's only what we've been taught to see as beautiful. And across history, humans have been taught to see some truly strange things as desirable. Welcome to the world of ohaguro, the ancient Japanese practice of tooth blackening. It's our last stop on this journey through deadly beauty. And unlike everything else we've discussed, this one might not have killed anyone. But it reveals something essential about beauty that ties together every story we've told tonight. Let's finish this. Ohaguro, literally black teeth, was practiced in Japan from at least the Kofun period around 300-710 CE all the way through to the Meiji era, which ended in 1912. That's over 1,600 years. Longer than Christianity has existed in its current form, longer than the English language has existed. For more than a millennium and a half, blackening your teeth was considered beautiful, sophisticated, and high status in Japanese culture. The practice was particularly associated with married women and court nobility. When a woman got married, she would begin blackening her teeth as a sign of her new status. Single women kept their natural tooth color, so you could literally tell by looking at someone's teeth whether they were married or not. But it wasn't just women. Men of the aristocratic and samurai classes also practiced ohaguro, though it was less universal for men than for women. The practice was deeply tied to status, formality, and cultural identity. Now, before we go further, let's talk about what this actually looked like. Because black teeth sounds simple, but the process was anything but. Making a ohaguro dye was a complex, time-consuming process that required specific ingredients and careful preparation. First, you'd take iron filings, literally shavings of iron, often from old swords or tools, and soak them in tea or sake. The iron would oxidize, creating a dark solution called kanamizu, or iron water. Then you'd add gall nuts from Japanese sumac trees. These are abnormal growths on the tree caused by insect larvae, and they're rich in tannic acid. Mix these together and let them ferment for a few days, and you'd get a thick, black, foul-smelling liquid. Historical accounts describe the smell as absolutely terrible, like rotting metal mixed with vinegar. The preparation would stink up an entire house. To apply it, women would use a small brush or cloth to coat each tooth with the black dye. They'd let it dry, which took time, and because the dye would wear off from eating and drinking, the whole process had to be repeated every 3 days or so. Every 3 days. For their entire married lives. Imagine that commitment. Imagine making this horrible-smelling dye every few days, carefully applying it to each tooth, letting it dry and doing it all over again in 72 hours, for decades. That's dedication to beauty. That's adherence to cultural standards. That's what happens when appearance becomes ritual. Now you might be wondering why black, why not white teeth like most cultures value? What's beautiful about blackened teeth? The answer, like most things in cultural history, is complicated and has multiple layers. One practical reason: it hid tooth decay. In medieval and early modern Japan, dental hygiene was rudimentary at best. Many people had cavity stains or discoloured teeth. Black dye covered all of that. Everyone's teeth looked uniformly black regardless of their actual condition. There was also a class element. The process of making and applying ohaguro required time, materials, and leisure. Working-class women who spent all day labouring in fields didn't have time to blacken their teeth every 3 days, so black teeth became a marker of wealth and status proof that you didn't have to work. But there was also an aesthetic component that's harder for modern Westerners to understand. In traditional Japanese aesthetics, there's a concept called wabi-sabi, finding beauty in imperfection, impermanence, and natural aging. There's also a preference in many contexts for subdued muted colours over bright ones. White teeth are bright, attention-catching, flashy. In certain aesthetic frameworks that's considered gaudy or immature. Black teeth by contrast are subtle, dignified, refined. They don't draw attention to the mouth. They create a harmonious, understated appearance. And there was sexual symbolism too. In Japanese erotic art and literature, blackened teeth were associated with adult feminine sexuality and marital intimacy. Natural white teeth were seen as childish or virginal. Black teeth signalled maturity, experience, marriageability. It's the exact opposite of Western beauty standards that fetishize youth and innocence. In Japan, maturity was desirable, adult womanhood was beautiful, and black teeth symbolized that. Let me tell you about a woman named Lady Murasaki Shikibu, author of The Tale of Genji, written around the year Radzon CE. It's often called the world's first novel, and Lady Murasaki was one of the most educated, sophisticated women in Japanese history. In her personal diary, she describes the court ladies around her, and she mentions their blackened teeth as a mark of elegance and refinement. She describes a young girl who hasn't yet blackened her teeth as looking unfinished, not quite ready for adult society. This wasn't a woman being forced into a beauty practice she hated. This was an intellectual, a writer, someone who had the education and status to question conventions, and she thought black teeth were beautiful, because that's what her culture taught her beauty looked like. That's the power of cultural conditioning. It can make anything seem beautiful, even black teeth, even bound feet, even 14-inch waists, even anything. Now here's where Ohaguro differs from most of the practices we've discussed tonight. It wasn't particularly harmful. Yes, the dye tasted bad. Yes, it smelled terrible. Yes, it was time-consuming, but it didn't poison you. The iron and tannic acid mixture actually had some antibacterial properties that might have helped prevent tooth decay and gum disease. Some dental historians think Ohaguro might have actually been beneficial for oral health in the absence of modern dentistry. There are accounts of the dye causing some mouth irritation or sensitivity in some people, but nothing compared to the organ failure from mercury, the radiation damage from X-rays, or the crushed organs from extreme corseting. Ohaguro was uncomfortable and inconvenient, but it wasn't deadly, which makes it different from almost everything else we've covered tonight. But it does share one crucial element with all those other practices. It was enforced by social pressure. Married women were expected to blacken their teeth. Not doing so marked you as strange, rebellious, or lower class. You could choose not to do it, but there were social consequences. The harm wasn't physical, it was social. It was the pressure to conform the judgment if you didn't, the way beauty standards constrain choices even when they don't directly damage bodies. The end of Ohaguro came with the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Japan was rapidly modernizing, opening up to Western influence, and trying to present itself as a civilized nation by Western standards. And Western visitors to Japan were horrified by Ohaguro. They wrote about it in their travel accounts with disgust and incomprehension. The barbaric practice of tooth blackening, they called it. Hideous, repulsive, primitive. Never mind that Europeans were still tight-lacing women into corsets that caused organ damage. Never mind that American women were using lead-based cosmetics. Never mind that the West had its own beauty practices that were far more harmful than blackening teeth with iron and tannic acid. Blackened teeth looked strange to Western eyes, so it was labelled as backwards and uncivilized. In 1870, the Meiji government issued an edict discouraging Ohaguro, particularly among the upper classes and anyone who had contact with foreigners. The message was clear: if Japan wanted to be taken seriously on the world stage, Japanese people needed to look more Western. White teeth, Western clothes, Western beauty standards. The practice declined rapidly over the next few decades. By the early 1900s it was rare. By the 1920s it had essentially disappeared, except in some traditional theatre contexts and a few rural areas. Another cultural practice erased by colonialism and westernization. Another tradition lost because it didn't conform to European standards. And yes, I know Ohaguro isn't as culturally important as many practices that were suppressed. I know most Japanese people today don't mourn its loss. But the pattern matters. The power dynamic matters. The assumption that Western beauty standards are natural and everything else is strange that matters. Here's what's beautiful about the Ohaguro story, though. It proves that beauty is arbitrary. If you can make black teeth beautiful for 600 years, you can make anything beautiful. You can make any body type, any feature, any characteristic desirable if enough people agree to see it that way, which means you can also unmake beauty standards. You can decide that actually black teeth aren't beautiful anymore. You can decide that white teeth are better, or that tooth color doesn't matter at all. Beauty standards aren't laws of nature. They're not genetic imperatives. They're just agreements, cultural consensus, shared delusions if you want to be cynical about it. And if they're just agreements, they can be changed. Think about that. Every beauty standard that makes you feel inadequate, every magazine cover that makes you feel too fat, too dark, too pale, too old, too wrinkled, too anything, it's all just an agreement you never consented to, an agreement that could be revoked tomorrow if enough people decided to stop agreeing. Throughout this long night, we've seen a consistent pattern, different practices, different cultures, different time periods, but the same underlying dynamics. Someone in power, usually men, usually with economic interest, decides what beauty looks like. That standard is then enforced through social pressure, economic incentives, and moral judgment. Women modify their bodies to meet that standard, often at great cost. Some die, most suffer, and then the standard changes and it starts all over again with something new. From ceruse to mercury to arsenic to radium to X-rays, from foot binding to corseting to cranial deformation, from belladonna to coal to ohagoro. Different methods, same system. The beauty industry has killed more women than most wars. It's damaged more bodies than most diseases. And it's done it all while calling itself empowering, while claiming to make women more beautiful, more confident, more valuable. It's the longest-running scam in human history. And it's still running. But here's what gives me hope, and I need you to hear this, because we've spent hours in darkness, and we need some light before we end. Every single practice we've discussed tonight eventually ended or was exposed as harmful. Not all of them have ended. Mercury skin, lightening is still happening as we discussed, but most have. The lead face paint, the belladonna eye drops the arsenic wafers, the radium cosmetics, the X-ray hair removal, the extreme tight lacing, the foot binding all gone or vastly reduced. Change is possible. Standards can shift. Practices can be abandoned. It takes time. It takes awareness. It takes people willing to speak uncomfortable truths. It takes scientists documenting harm. It takes activists demanding better. It takes individuals deciding they're worth more than conformity to impossible standards. But it happens. Slowly, imperfectly, unevenly, but it happens. We're not doomed to repeat these patterns forever. We can learn. We can change. We can build a world where beauty doesn't require suffering. We're not there yet, obviously. But we're closer than we were 100 years ago. Closer than we were 50 years ago. Even closer than we were 20 years ago. The fact that we're having this conversation, the fact that you've spent hours listening to these stories, that's part of the change. Awareness is the first step. So what do you do with all this information? What do you do after spending a night learning about all the ways beauty has harmed women throughout history? Here's what I hope you do. First, be kind to yourself. Every time you look in the mirror and criticize what you see, remember that you're using standards that were created to make you feel inadequate. Standards that have changed constantly throughout history. Standards that might be completely different in 50 years. Your body is not the problem. The standards are the problem. Second, be critical of beauty marketing. Every time you see an advertisement for a beauty product, ask yourself, what is this really selling? Is it selling a solution to a real problem, or is it creating a problem to sell a solution? Is it empowering, or is it just exploitation, wearing a feminist mask? Third, opt out where you don't have to wear makeup if you don't want to. You don't have to shave. You don't have to diet. You don't have to do any of it. There will be social consequences, I won't lie to you, but those consequences are usually less severe than you fear. And every person who opts out makes it easier for the next person to do the same. Fourth, speak up. When you see harmful beauty standards being promoted, say something. When you hear people body shaming, push back. When beauty companies sell dangerous products, call them out. Use whatever platform you have social media conversations with friends, your own choices to challenge the system. And fifth, remember the women we've talked about tonight. The ones who ate arsenic and breathed mercury and broke their bones and poisoned themselves and did everything society asked of them and still weren't considered beautiful enough. Remember them. Honor their suffering by refusing to repeat it. You know what's interesting? We started this journey in Renaissance Venice with women painting their faces with lead, and we're ending in Meiji-era Japan with women blackening their teeth with iron. Opposite sides of the world. Completely different beauty standards, white faces versus black teeth. But the same underlying truth beauty is whatever your culture tells you it is. And what your culture tells you is beautiful is usually designed to control you, to keep you occupied with your appearance so you don't have time or energy to challenge the systems that oppress you. It's a distraction. An expensive, time-consuming, sometimes deadly distraction. But here's the revolutionary thought. What if we just stopped? What if we collectively decided that our natural bodies are fine, that we don't need to modify, improve or perfect ourselves, that we can just exist as we are? It sounds simple. It's the hardest thing in the world. But it's possible. The women who used sarus didn't think they could stop. The women who bound their feet didn't think they had a choice. The women who blackened their teeth thought it was just how things were done. But all those practices ended, which means our harmful practices can end too. We've been together for over 2 hours now. We've travelled through 1,000 years of history and across every continent. We've seen beauty practices that were deadly painful, time-consuming, expensive and bizarre. We've seen women suffer in ways that should never have been normalised. But we've also seen resilience, resistance, change. The practices ended. The women survived well, many of them didn't, but their descendants did. And we're here now, aware of the patterns, able to make different choices. That awareness is power. Use it. I want to thank you for staying with me through this entire journey. I know it's been heavy. I know some of these stories have been hard to hear, but I think they're important. I think we need to understand where beauty standards come from and what they've cost us. We need to see the pattern so we can break it. If this video made you think differently about beauty, about your own relationship with your appearance, about the pressures you face, then it was worth making. And if you found value in these stories, if you think other people need to hear them, please share this. Like it. Comment with your thoughts. Tell me which story affected you most. Tell me what beauty standards you're choosing to reject. And subscribe if you want more stories like this. Because history is full of lessons we haven't learned yet, full of patterns we keep repeating, full of truths we need to hear. There are more stories to tell, more systems to examine, more truths to uncover. But for tonight, we're done. You've been incredibly patient and thoughtful listeners. Get some rest. Breathe deeply. Your lungs aren't compressed by a corset. Look at your hands. Your fingers aren't scarred from lead or mercury. Touch your skull. It's the shape it was meant to be. Your body exactly as it is right now is a small miracle. It survived in a world that's been trying to reshape it since birth. That's something to be proud of. Sleep well. Dream of a world where beauty doesn't require suffering. And then when you wake up, help build that world. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember, you were beautiful before anyone ever told you that you weren't. Good night.